She knelt before another woman while her husband watched and smiled. But what Damien Moretti never knew was that by the time Elena Carter's knees touched that cold marble floor, she had already taken everything from him. Not with a gun, not with rage, with a pen. And years of silence he mistook for weakness. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have protected you, stay until the very end. Hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The night it happened, the rain came down hard over Manhattan, the kind that turned the streets into black mirrors and drove the city's worst secrets indoors. Elena Carter stood at the top of the marble staircase inside the Cortellini Grand, a private event space on the Upper East Side that the Moretti family rented 4 times a year for what the invitation cards called a gathering of associates. Everyone who mattered in New York's organized crime landscape knew what that meant. The Calabrese family from Brooklyn would be there, the Shen Consortium's street representatives, the Varga brothers out of Queens with their thick necks and thin patience, and of course, Damien Moretti, host, king, and husband, standing at the center of it all like he'd been carved there. Elena had dressed carefully, not to impress him. That impulse had burned out of her sometime around year 3 of their marriage, when she realized that nothing she wore, nothing she said, nothing she accomplished would ever earn a second glance from the man she'd legally bound herself to at 26. She dressed carefully because she understood the rules of these gatherings better than most people in attendance, including Damien. You presented strength, you presented calm, you gave away nothing. She wore a deep burgundy dress, structured at the shoulder, and her dark hair pulled back with the kind of effortless discipline that took 40 minutes to achieve. No jewelry except the simple gold band on her left hand, which she'd considered removing that morning and decided against, for reasons she didn't fully examine. She looked like exactly what she was. A woman who had spent 7 years learning how to disappear into the wallpaper of a dangerous man's life while quietly building something no one could see. The ballroom below was already crowded when she descended. Round tables draped in white linen, crystal glasses catching light from a chandelier the size of a small car, men in suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and their wives, girlfriends, companions, arranged along the edges of the room like decorative pieces that had learned to stay still. Elena had been one of those women once. She wasn't anymore. The difference was invisible to everyone in the room, which was exactly how she'd designed it. She found her place at table 6, not the head table, never the head table, and sat with a composed expression while a waiter poured sparkling water into her glass. Around her, conversation moved in the low, encrypted rhythm these men preferred in public. Nothing direct, everything implied. She nodded when nodded to, smiled when smiled at, ate the first course without tasting it. Damien arrived 20 minutes late, which was his signature. He was 6'2", broad across the shoulders, with the kind of dark, heavy handsomeness that photographed well and aged into something almost brutish. He moved through the room like current through a wire. Everything adjacent to him adjusted. Men straightened, women softened. The ambient noise shifted half a register down. He shook hands, clapped shoulders, laughed at the right moments with the ease of a man who had never once in his adult life doubted that he belonged exactly where he was standing. Elena watched him from table 6 and felt nothing she couldn't name. Then Vanessa Hale walked in behind him. She was tall, blonde, with the engineered beauty of someone who had invested heavily in the maintenance of her appearance since her early 20s. She wore black, strapless, precise, and moved with a possessive ease that was either entirely natural or so well practiced it had become the same thing. She was 31 to Elena's 33, and she had been in Damien's life for at least 4 years, though Elena had only confirmed it 2 years ago. She filed that confirmation away the same way she filed everything, quietly, completely, without reaction. What Elena had not anticipated was what came next. Damien crossed the room to the head table, and instead of sitting without comment, instead of maintaining the fiction they had maintained for 7 years, the comfortable public pretense of a marriage that functioned, he stopped in the center of the ballroom with perhaps 60 of New York's most powerful and dangerous people watching, and he raised his voice. "I'd like a moment," he said, and the room went quiet the way rooms only go quiet when they feel something is about to happen that cannot be undone. Elena set down her water glass. He spoke for about 90 seconds. She would replay those 90 seconds in her mind over the following hours, not with the jagged horror of someone blindsided, but with the slow, precise attention of someone cataloging damage. He spoke about loyalty. He spoke about the people who stood beside you and the people who were merely present. He spoke about Vanessa, by name, in front of all of them, with a warmth in his voice Elena had never once been the recipient of. And then he looked across the room directly at Elena, and he said, with the calm of a man who believed absolutely in his own authority, "Elena, come here." Well, she could have refused. She spent a fraction of a second considering it, not out of fear, but because she was constitutionally incapable of acting without first running the calculation. If she refused, he would escalate. He would escalate in front of 60 witnesses, and whatever control she had over the next several hours depended on him believing, until the very last moment, that she was exactly what he'd always taken her for, a compliant woman who had been outmaneuvered. So she stood. She crossed the room. Her heels made no sound on the carpeted floor because the room had gone that quiet. The particular silence of people who understand they are witnessing something that will be discussed for years, and who are simultaneously relieved it is not happening to them. Damien looked at her with something she could only describe as theatrical satisfaction. He had planned this. He had arranged the room, chosen the moment, calculated the audience. This was not impulse. This was performance. "Kneel," he said. One word. Elena Carter looked at her husband of 7 years. She looked at Vanessa Hale, who stood slightly behind him, wearing an expression Elena read as discomfort with a layer of triumph underneath it. The expression of someone who has gotten what they wanted and is only now beginning to sense the weight of it. She looked at the 60 faces arranged around them. The Calabrese patriarch, the Varga brothers, the Shen representative, wives and girlfriends who had gone very still. And then Elena Carter knelt. Not because she was broken, not because she was afraid. She knelt because the calculation completed itself in under 2 seconds, and the answer was this. She had 6 hours before the business day began on the East Coast. Every minute she spent in this room making a scene was a minute she wasn't spending on a phone. She held that position for 10 seconds. She felt the cold of the marble through the thin fabric of her dress. She kept her face neutral, her breathing even, her eyes fixed on a point on the floor that could have been anything. A flaw in the marble, a shadow from the chandelier. And she made a decision she had been building toward for 3 years without fully articulating it, even to herself. She would walk out of this room, and she would not come back. Damien said something above her, something about loyalty, about what it meant to stand by a man like him, about the distinction between a wife and a partner, and the room held its terrible silence, and then, as if on a signal, applause moved through it. Not everyone, maybe half, but enough. Elena stood. She smoothed the front of her dress with one hand. She looked at Damien with an expression that gave him nothing, no rage, no tears, no visible wound, and she turned and walked toward the exit. Behind her, she heard Damien say something low to the man beside him, and the man laughed. She did not turn around. The coat check woman handed her her wrap without making eye contact. The elevator came. Elena stepped in and stood alone in the mirrored interior and looked at her own reflection for the 11-second descent to the lobby. And what she saw there was not a woman who had been destroyed. It was a woman who had just been handed the last thing she needed: justification. She had spent 3 years preparing for a future she was not entirely certain she would ever actually pursue. Not because she doubted the preparation. The preparation was meticulous, airtight, the product of 18-hour days and a legal mind that Damien had never once thought to credit her with, partly because he hadn't known she had one, and partly because even if he had, he would not have considered it relevant. She had doubted herself, not her competence, her willingness. There was a version of her that had spent years telling itself that the marriage was a survivable arrangement, that the coldness and the silence and the careful management of her own wants down to near nothing was simply the price of the stability she'd built around herself. That version of her had knelt on cold marble while 60 people watched. Elena stepped out of the elevator into the lobby of the Cortellini Grand, crossed the marble floor, different marble here, beige instead of gray, she noted this absurdly, pushed through the revolving door into the rain-soaked Manhattan night, and stood on the sidewalk for 30 seconds while her lungs adjusted to the outside air. Then she took out her phone and made the first call. Her attorney was a woman named Sandra Voss, a 60-year-old corporate lawyer with offices in Midtown who had been structuring legal documents for Elena for 3 years under a retainer agreement Damien knew about and had never examined. Sandra had been Elena's first hire, her most important hire, and the only person outside of herself who understood the full architecture of what Elena had built. Sandra picked up on the second ring, which meant she had been awake and waiting. "It happened," Elena said. A brief pause. "Are you safe?" "Yes. I'm outside." She stepped under the awning as rain began to hit her shoulders. "We're moving." "I'll make the calls," Sandra said. "The escrow accounts are pre-positioned, signature authority transferred on your instruction. Start with the Hudson properties, then the Midtown Holdings, then the Warehouse Consortium. Timeline? I need everything processed before the banks open." Another pause. Shorter this time. "Elena, that's 6 hours." "I know how long 6 hours is." Sandra did not argue. That was what Elena had paid her for, not to argue and not to flinch. "I'll get Marcus and the Jersey team on the phone within the hour. The offshore transfers were staged 2 weeks ago. We're only executing." "Execute," Elena said. She ended the call. She stood for a moment in the rain, the city moving around her the way it always moved, indifferent, enormous, profoundly unconcerned with the specific devastation of any single human life. And then she pulled up a car service app and requested a pickup. She did not cry. She had examined this possibility in herself at various quiet moments over the past years, wondering how she would feel, wondering what would break loose in her chest when the thing she had prepared for actually arrived. But there was nothing to break. That was the truth she had been living with. Whatever Damien Moretti had once meant to her, the version of him she'd believed in at 26, the version she'd married, had been dismantled so slowly and so completely that by the time she stood in that ballroom and received the full measure of his contempt, there was nothing left in her for it to reach. That was not peace. She understood that. It was the absence of something that should have been there, and she had learned not to confuse the two. The car arrived. She got in. She gave the driver an address in Midtown, not her apartment, not yet, and sat back against the seat as the city unreeled outside the rain-streaked window. She had first understood the depth of what she controlled approximately 3 years into her marriage, when Damien, in one of his characteristic displays of imperial confidence, had handed her a stack of documents to organize and told her, without looking up from his phone, that she was good with paperwork. He'd meant it as a diminishment. What he had actually given her was access. The Moretti financial empire was, on its surface, a collection of legitimate businesses, commercial real estate, a logistics company, 2 restaurant groups, a string of car dealerships in the outer boroughs in northern New Jersey, a private equity arm that made small investments in technology companies. Beneath the surface, and Elena had access to the beneath because Damien never imagined she would look, was a network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and cross-collateralized assets that existed primarily to launder the proceeds from the Moretti family's less documented revenue streams. Elena had not touched the dirty money. Not once. She had known better than to touch it, not for moral reasons, though she had those, but because she understood that the moment she introduced criminal assets into what she was building, she handed prosecutors a weapon she couldn't control. What she had done instead was something more surgical. She had identified, over the course of 3 years, every legitimate asset within the Moretti structure, every piece of real estate held through a cleanly documented LLC, every above-board business investment, every legally incorporated entity. And then she had, slowly and painstakingly, and with Sandra Voss's guidance, restructured the ownership of those assets through a sequence of transactions that were individually unremarkable and collectively catastrophic. It had required Damien's signature on several dozen documents over 3 years. He had signed them without reading them. He had signed them because he had looked at Elena and seen a woman who was good with paperwork, and it had never once occurred to him that the woman good with paperwork was rewriting the architecture of his empire one clause at a time. The Moretti name appeared on none of the final ownership documents. Elena's did not either, not directly. The assets were held through a legitimate holding company, Arlen Capital Partners, whose sole beneficial owner was Elena Carter, an identity she had carefully and legally separated from the name Elena Moretti 3 years ago via a corporate filing that had gone unremarked because nobody was looking. By the time the car pulled up to the Midtown offices of Voss and Associates, Sandra was already there, the lights on in the conference room on the 14th floor, two associates visible through the glass moving between terminals. Elena took the elevator up. Sandra met her at the door wearing a gray blazer over what appeared to be the early stages of pajamas. She'd clearly been home when the call came, and holding 2 cups of coffee. "Marcus is on the line from Jersey," Sandra said, handing Elena a cup. "Redmond's team in the Caymans is standing by. The Luxembourg accounts are already processing." "Any flags from the counterparties?" "1. The Tillman Group's attorney wanted additional verification on the warehouse consortium transfer, standard for a transaction that size. We pre-signed the verification authorizations 2 weeks ago. I faxed them 40 minutes ago." "And the residential properties?" Sandra moved to the conference room table and opened a laptop to a spreadsheet Elena knew intimately. "The Park Avenue penthouse closed in escrow this afternoon at 4:30. The buyer was already conditionally approved. The Tribeca loft is structured as a 48-hour closing, already initiated. The Connecticut house is in a trust that we decoupled from the Moretti family trust in February. That transfer was completed in March." Elena sat down. She looked at the spreadsheet. She had looked at versions of this spreadsheet for 3 years, running the numbers, adjusting the structure, tracing the threads of what she was building and what she was dismantling simultaneously. Tonight, for the first time, it wasn't theoretical. "The Lexington Avenue building," she said. "Moretti Holdings, LLC, holds a 40% interest in a joint venture with 2 outside investors. We restructured that LLC in January. Remember the operating agreement amendment that went through on his signature as part of the general liability update?" "I remember." The amendment included a change of control clause that transferred decision-making authority and economic interest to Arlen Capital upon a triggering event. The triggering event was defined as any change in the marital status of the LLC's original principal, including separation. Elena paused. "I'm separating tonight." "I know," Sandra said, "which is why I've already filed the initial paperwork." She looked at Elena across the table. Not gently, not harshly. Sandra Voss had a manner that was essentially geological, present, solid, undecorated. "There are going to be attorneys on the other side of this by morning." "I know." "Good attorneys, probably the best. They'll be looking at legally executed documents, Sandra. They'll be looking for anything that can be characterized as fraud or coercion." "Then they'll be disappointed." Elena set down her coffee. "Every document Damien signed was accurately described to him. I did not misrepresent the purpose of a single transaction. He chose not to read them. That was his right." Sandra was quiet for a moment. "I want to be honest with you. What you've done here is technically, legally defensible. I'm confident in that. I've structured it to be confident in it, but it's also going to be characterized by the people across the table from us as something else. Let them characterize it." "Elena." "Sandra." Elena met her attorney's eyes. "He made me kneel, in a room full of people, to prove something to the woman he's been keeping for 4 years. I've been building this for 3 years because I needed to be sure I could survive without what he controls. I'm sure. Tonight was the last data point I needed." She paused. "I'm not asking you to evaluate whether I was justified. I'm asking you to execute the strategy." Sandra looked at her for another moment. Then she nodded once and picked up her phone. The next 4 hours were the most methodical of Elena Carter's life, which was saying something. She sat at that conference table and worked through the spreadsheet line by line, confirming each transaction as it completed, answering questions from Marcus in Jersey and the Cayman team and 2 other attorneys Sandra pulled in by phone, all of whom were operating under previously established retainer agreements that Elena had put in place years ago for exactly this moment. She drank 4 cups of coffee. She ate half a sandwich that someone produced from somewhere around 2 in the morning. She did not check her personal phone. The luxury penthouse on Park Avenue, the one Damien used for entertaining, the one that had a private elevator and a terrace with an unobstructed view of Central Park, and a kitchen that had never been cooked in, closed in escrow to a legitimate buyer at 1:47 a.m. The buyer was a tech executive from Seattle who had been conditionally approved for months, who had no knowledge of the larger architecture he was stepping into and no reason to care. The Midtown office building that housed three of Damien's front-facing legitimate businesses transferred to Arlen Capital Partners at 2:15 a.m. under the terms of a restructured management agreement that Damien had signed 18 months ago and filed with his accountant, who had noted it and moved on. The logistics company, Moretti Transport, 22 vehicles, 3 warehouses, contracts with 6 legitimate commercial clients, had been restructured as a limited partnership with Arlen Capital, holding the controlling LP interest. That restructuring had completed on paper 6 months ago. Elena's execution of the transfer of operational control was a single instruction to the partnership administrator, sent at 3:30 a.m. The car dealerships were the most complex piece. They operated under a franchise agreement that included individual ownership disclosures, which meant the transfer required written notification to the franchisor. Notification Elena had prepared and pre-positioned, which went out at 4 a.m. By the time the first gray light was beginning to appear over the Manhattan skyline, Elena had her laptop open to the final spreadsheet view, looking at a column of green confirmations running down the screen like a sentence she had spent 3 years learning to write. She was not triumphant. She had expected to feel something sharper, some version of vindication or satisfaction that would have a clear shape to it. What she felt instead was very quiet, specific and quiet, like the silence in a room after a long sound has finally stopped. Sandra came to stand beside her, looking at the screen. "That's everything on the primary list," she said. "The restaurant group. Closing in 4 hours. The buyer's attorney opens at 8. Sandra paused. "Elena, you should sleep." "I'll sleep after." "After what?" Elena closed the laptop. She looked at her hands on the table, clean hands, unmarked, the hands of a woman who had never once picked up a weapon and had just dismantled an empire with them. "After I know the morning is what it's going to be," she said. Sandra sat down across from her. Around them, the office had quieted. The 2 associates had gone home around 3, and the conference room was lit now by the overhead fluorescence and the early hint of day through the windows. "Can I ask you something?" Sandra said. Elena looked at her. "Did you know, when you started building this, did you know you were actually going to use it?" Elena was quiet for a moment. "I knew I needed to be able to use it," she said finally. "Whether I would was a different question." She thought about the marble floor, the weight of 60 pairs of eyes. Damien's voice above her, performing certainty. "I don't think I decided until I was already in the car." Sandra nodded. She did not offer anything further on the subject, which was one of the things Elena valued most about her. At 6:48 a.m., Elena's personal phone buzzed. She looked at it. 7 missed calls from a number she recognized as Damien's personal line. 3 texts. She read the texts with the neutral attention of someone reading a document they need to process, but have no personal investment in. The first said, "Where are you?" The second said, "Call me back, now." The third said, "Elena, I swear to God if you don't—" The third text ended there, mid-sentence, as if he'd thought better of it or been interrupted. She set the phone face down on the table. "He's awake," she said. Sandra looked at her. "What do you want to do?" "Nothing," Elena said. "Not yet." She thought about what the morning would look like from Damien's perspective. He would have woken in the mansion, the large house in Westchester that he believed was his, in a way that had nothing to do with paperwork, because men like Damien always believed that what they occupied was theirs by nature rather than by deed. He would have made phone calls. He would have spoken to whatever associate or advisor he contacted first in a crisis, and that advisor would have looked at the relevant accounts and holdings and told him something that didn't make sense. And then Damien would have made more calls, and those calls would have started to form a pattern, and the pattern would have led him, by some point in the next hour or two, to the same conclusion that Elena had reached 3 years ago, that the architecture of what he believed he owned had been quietly, surgically, completely rewritten. She picked up her coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway. "He's going to come looking for me," she said. "Yes," Sandra agreed. "He's going to say I stole from him." Yes. Elena set down the cup. And we're going to be ready for that. Sandra opened her own laptop and began pulling up the documentation they would need. The paper trail that showed clearly and completely that every transaction had been legally executed, every signature Damien's own, every disclosure made. It was a wall of paper, 3 years thick, and it was impenetrable. Elena had made sure of it, not because she had known for certain she would need it, but because she had understood from the very beginning of this process that the only protection available to a woman in her position was one that required no one to believe her. The documents didn't need anyone to believe her. They were self-sufficient. Her phone buzzed again. Different number this time. She looked at it. One of Damien's attorneys, a man named Harlow, who handled his legitimate business affairs. She let it go to voicemail. 20 seconds later, her phone buzzed with a voicemail notification. She did not listen to it. Across town, in the Westchester mansion that no longer belonged to him, though he did not fully understand this yet, Damien Moretti was making phone calls with increasing desperation to people who were telling him things he could not yet make himself believe. Each call confirmed what the last had suggested, and the confirmation was accumulating into something that he didn't have a framework for, because he had built his entire life on the premise that the world organized itself around his will, and the world was currently failing to do that in a way he had never encountered before. Elena did not know exactly what he was doing, of course. She constructed this picture from what she knew of him. 7 years of studying a man in close proximity gives you a model of him that runs in your head with uncomfortable accuracy. She thought, he is sitting in that kitchen, the large one, with the island, where she had spent 1,000 mornings that meant nothing to him, and he is gripping his phone so hard his knuckles are white. And he is talking to a man who is telling him that the house he is sitting in is under a purchase agreement that completed 60 days ago. And he does not believe this. And the man is telling him it is true. And Damien is asking how. And the man is saying he doesn't know yet. And Damien is saying find out. And the man is saying yes and hanging up. And Damien is sitting in a kitchen that is no longer his, in a house that is no longer his, and the anger that is moving through him is the specific, particular anger of a man who has never in his adult life encountered a wall he could not go around or through or over, and is now standing in front of one. Elena sat in a conference room in Midtown as the city woke up around her, and she waited for the morning to become what it was going to be. At 7:23 a.m., Sandra's phone rang. She answered it, listened for 15 seconds, and looked at Elena. "It's Harlow," she said. "He says Damien is requesting an urgent meeting. Today." Elena was quiet for a moment. She thought about the marble floor again. She thought about the silence in that ballroom. She thought about a single word delivered in the voice of a man who had mistaken fear for something more durable. "Tell him," she said, "that Ms. Carter is represented by counsel, and all communication should be directed to this office." Sandra relayed this. She listened to the response. Her expression did not change. "He says Damien is saying this is not a legal matter. He wants to speak to you directly." "Everything," Elena said, "is a legal matter now." Sandra ended the call. She looked at Elena across the table, and something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, because Sandra Voss was not a warm woman, but something that recognized what Elena had just done and found it. On balance, correct. "What do you want to do now?" she asked. Elena stood. She was tired. Not the soft tiredness of someone who needed sleep, but the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something enormous for a very long time and has only just set it down, and whose body is only now noticing the weight it was bearing. She straightened her dress. She thought about the next hours, the next days, the wall of documentation that was going to be Sandra's domain, while Elena began the next chapter of something she had been thinking about for 3 years, but had not let herself fully imagine. "I'm going to find somewhere to sleep," she said, "and when I wake up, I need you to have the divorce filing ready." Sandra nodded. "It'll be ready." Elena picked up her coat from the back of the chair. At the door, she paused. "Sandra," she said. "Yes." "He's going to send people to find me, not violent people. He won't go that route, not yet. He's too smart for that. But people, investigators, probably. We'll manage that." "I know." She looked at the window, at the city going gold now in the morning light. I just wanted to be sure you knew what kind of man we were dealing with. I've known what kind of man we were dealing with, Sandra said, since you hired me. Elena walked out of the office and into the hallway and pressed the elevator button and stood very still while she waited, and the city hummed around her through the walls, enormous and indifferent, and full of the kind of space she had not allowed herself to imagine occupying until now. And somewhere, across that city, Damien Moretti was realizing, phone by phone, call by call, confirmation by confirmation, that the woman he had made kneel before him the night before had been, for 3 years, the quiet and absolute architect of his ruin. And the thing he did not yet know, the thing that would become clear in the hours ahead when his attorneys finally reached the right documents and ran the right searches, was that there was nothing he could do about it. The elevator arrived. Elena stepped in. The doors closed behind her. She did not look at her reflection this time. She already knew what she would see. Outside, a black car was already waiting. She had requested it from the office. And as she stepped through the lobby doors and into the sharp morning air, her phone began to ring again. She looked at the screen. Damien. Direct line. Not through Harlow. She watched the phone ring. 6 times. 7. It stopped. Then it started again. She slid the phone into her coat pocket without answering and got into the car. And as it pulled into Manhattan traffic, the phone rang twice more from inside her pocket, and twice more she let it ring out. And by the 3rd call, she felt something she had not expected. Not satisfaction, not relief, but the first faint edge of something that might become, given enough time and space, something close to free. The car moved uptown through morning traffic, and the phone rang again. And this time when she looked at the screen, it was not Damien. It was a number she didn't recognize, an out-of-state area code, a number she had never seen before. And Elena Carter, who had not been caught off guard in 3 years, felt something cold move through her chest because she had an instinct, sharp and immediate, that this call was not from anyone on Damien's team. She answered it. The voice on the other end was a woman's, calm, professional, with the measured precision of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say. "Ms. Carter," the woman said, "my name is Agent Christine Reyes. I'm with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Division. We've been watching the Moretti organization for some time." A pause. "We'd like to speak with you at your earliest convenience. There are things we believe you know that could be very useful to us." Another pause. "And Ms. Carter, I want you to understand that how this conversation goes in the next 48 hours may determine quite a lot about how things go for everyone involved, including you." The car moved through the city. Elena looked out the window at the morning light on the buildings, and she thought about the 3 years she had spent building something no one could see, and the night she had spent dismantling something everyone thought was permanent, and the phone call she had just answered that suggested the next chapter was going to be more complicated than anything she had planned for. She said, "What time?" Agent Christine Reyes had a face that gave away almost nothing. That was the first thing Elena noticed when she walked into the conference room of a federal building on Worth Street at 9:15 in the morning, still wearing the burgundy dress from the night before. Her coat folded over one arm, her expression composed in the way that had become, over 7 years, as natural to her as breathing. Reyes was somewhere in her early 40s, compact and precise, with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of stillness that didn't come from calm. It came from discipline. She sat on one side of the table with a younger male agent named Duarte, who had a notepad and hadn't said anything yet. And she looked at Elena the way Elena imagined she looked at everything, as a problem with a shape she was still determining. There was a paper cup of coffee on Elena's side of the table. Elena sat down and did not touch it. "Thank you for coming," Reyes said. "I haven't agreed to anything," Elena said. "I want that understood before you say another word. I'm here because I wanted to understand the nature of this conversation. My attorney is aware I'm here. If this conversation becomes something other than what you described on the phone, I'll end it." Reyes nodded, not surprised, not annoyed. "Understood. You said you've been watching the Moretti organization for 4 years. Elena absorbed this. 4 years placed the beginning of their surveillance somewhere in the early stretch of her marriage. when she was still in the process of understanding what she had married into, when she was still telling herself stories about compartmentalization and survival that she would eventually stop believing. "What do you want from me?" she said. Reyes opened a folder on the table between them. She did not push it toward Elena. She left it in front of herself, but turned it so Elena could see the first page. It was a financial diagram. Elena recognized the general shape of it: shell companies, offshore accounts, domestic LLCs layered over one another in the pattern that was characteristic of organized crime asset management. She did not recognize the specific entities on the page, which told her that what Reyes was showing her was not the layer Elena had been working in. This was deeper, the dirty layer, the one Elena had never touched. "We have 4 years of financial surveillance on the Moretti organization," Reyes said. "We have wire intercepts, banking records, 3 confidential informants, and a partial paper trail that gets us most of the way to where we need to go." She paused. "Most of the way? And you think I can take you the rest of the way?" "We think you have access to information about the financial structure of the Moretti organization that our other sources don't." Elena looked at the diagram. She looked at it with the careful attention she gave to all documents, reading the structure rather than the specific names, tracing the logic of how it was built. Then she looked up at Reyes. "I want to be precise with you," she said. "I have spent 7 years managing the legitimate side of my husband's business interests. I have no direct knowledge of the criminal revenue streams. I never participated in them. I never touched them." She paused. "What I have is a comprehensive understanding of how the legitimate structure was organized and used, which entities were clean, which were clean adjacent, and which ones, based on the patterns I observed without being told explicitly, were probably being used as pass-through vehicles." Reyes was quiet for a moment. Duarte, the younger agent, had stopped writing and was watching Elena with an expression she read as recalibrating. "Pass-through vehicles," Reyes repeated. "I'm not a federal agent," Elena said. "I'm not going to use your terminology, but yes, I know which of the legitimate entities had irregular cash flows that didn't match the reported business activity. I never asked why because I understood that asking why was dangerous. But I paid attention." She paused again. "I also built a legal structure over the past 3 years that has transferred the clean assets out of the Moretti organization entirely. You may have noticed some activity overnight." Reyes looked at her without blinking. "We noticed," she said. "Then you also know that every transaction was legal, documented, and executed under valid contractual authority." Elena kept her voice even. "I'm not here to negotiate my own exposure, Agent Reyes, because I don't have any. What I'm here to understand is what you're asking for and what you're offering." Reyes closed the folder. She leaned back slightly in her chair, the first adjustment in posture she'd made since Elena sat down. "We're asking for cooperation, voluntary. In exchange, we're prepared to offer a formal agreement that clarifies your non-target status in the broader investigation and a structured cooperation arrangement that keeps your name out of any public indictment." "My name isn't in any indictment already." "No," Reyes said, "but defense attorneys in organized crime cases are very good at creating alternative narratives. If this goes to trial and the Moretti organization's lawyers need someone to point at, you're the most visible financial figure in the legitimate structure." She paused. "We can protect you from that, or we can let the chips fall." Elena picked up the paper cup of coffee. She drank from it. It was bad coffee, the kind that had been sitting since early morning. And she drank it anyway because her body needed the caffeine and because she was not going to let the quality of the coffee be the thing that showed on her face. "I want Sandra Voss in the room before I say anything substantive," she said. "Of course." Reyes reached into the folder and produced a card, which she slid across the table. "Have her call that number. We can reconvene this afternoon." Elena took the card. She stood. She put on her coat. At the door she stopped because there was something she needed to know, and she had decided on the way over that she would ask it directly. "Agent Reyes," she said. Reyes looked at her. "How long before Damien's attorneys figure out what happened to the assets?" "If they haven't already," Reyes said, "I'd estimate they have a complete picture by noon." Elena nodded. "And when they do?" He'll file for an injunction to freeze the transfers pending review. It'll get denied. Your paperwork is solid from what we've seen, but it'll create noise. Reyes paused. He's also going to come at you personally, not physically, not his style, but every attorney he has, every investigator he keeps on retainer. They'll be looking for anything that can be characterized as fraud, undue influence, or breach of fiduciary duty. Let them look, Elena said. It came out flat, factual, without the heat that might have made it sound like bravado. She meant it as a statement of conditions, not defiance. She walked out. The lobby of the federal building was all security checkpoints and fluorescent light, and Elena moved through it without looking at anyone, collected her phone from the security deposit, and stepped out onto Worth Street into air that tasted like the city after rain. Wet concrete, exhaust, the mineral edge of a morning that had been decided without her. She called Sandra immediately. Federal building, she said when Sandra picked up. Financial crimes enforcement, 4-year investigation. They want cooperation. I gave them nothing substantive. Sandra was quiet for 3 seconds. Elena, you went to a federal building without me. I needed to understand the landscape. That's what I'm for. I know. Elena walked. She didn't have a direction yet. She was walking because standing still felt wrong, because her body needed something to do while her mind processed the geometry of the morning. They're offering non-target status and a cooperation agreement. They have wire intercepts and informants. They're missing the connective tissue between the shell companies and the clean businesses. Which you have, which I can reconstruct from what I observed, without having directly participated in anything criminal. Elena. Sandra's voice had shifted into the register Elena recognized as genuine concern, which Sandra deployed rarely and without decoration. This is not a situation you can manage by yourself. You've spent 3 years managing something by yourself, and you did it brilliantly, but this is different. This is federal. I know it's federal. Then listen to me. Do not say one more word to those agents until I'm in the room. Not one more word. Not even about the weather. I told them to call you. Good. A pause. Where are you going now? I need to sleep. You need to sleep, Sandra repeated, as if confirming a strange fact. All right, go sleep. I'll call Reyes. We'll reconvene this afternoon. And Elena, stay off your personal phone. If Damien's team has any kind of surveillance capability, and they do, your location is visible every time you make a call. Elena stopped walking. She was at the corner of Worth and Broadway, and the city moved around her in both directions, and she stood in the middle of it feeling, for the first time in the entire length of this night, genuinely tired. Not the performance of tiredness, not the acknowledgement of it, actually tired in the bones, in the space behind her eyes. Sandra, she said, yes. He's going to try to find me. I know. I need somewhere that isn't my apartment and isn't anywhere he'd think of first. A pause. I have a guest suite in my building, 2nd floor. I'll text you the code. Another pause. Elena, you did something extraordinary last night. Now, let me do my job. Elena ended the call. She stood at the corner for another moment, the city loud around her, and then she hailed a cab and gave the driver Sandra's building address and sat in the back with her coat still on, watching the city slide past the window, thinking about the diagram Reyes had shown her, the shape of it, the structure, the particular way the shell companies nested inside one another, and recognizing in it the shadow of things she had observed over 7 years without ever being told directly. Patterns that lived in the gap between what was documented and what was done. She closed her eyes. She thought about the marble floor. She was asleep before the cab reached Tribeca. Damien Moretti had been awake since 5:30, and by the time the clock reached 10, he had made 41 phone calls and received confirmation from 4 different attorneys and 2 accountants of something he still could not fully metabolize. He had nothing. Not nothing in the colloquial sense, not the nothing of a setback or a temporary liquidity problem or a deal gone sideways. Nothing in the absolute structural sense. The legitimate layer of his empire, the real estate, the businesses, the investment holdings that had served, for years, as both the public face of his wealth and the legal scaffolding that held everything else up, had been transferred cleanly and completely to an entity he had never heard of, controlled by a woman he had spent 7 years not really looking at. He sat in the kitchen of the Westchester mansion, which he had been informed, via a document his attorney faxed at 8 a.m. He was under a completed purchase agreement, and he stared at the surface of the kitchen island and felt something moving through his chest that he had not felt since he was a teenager, the specific vertigo of a ground that would not hold. Harlow, senior attorney, 20-year relationship, the man who handled every legitimate transaction Damien had ever executed, sat across the island with an expression that was attempting to stay professional and failing in small ways. There was tension in his jaw. His tie was slightly off-center. He had been awake as long as Damien had, and he looked like it. "Walk me through it again," Damien said. Harlow pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose. "Damien, walk me through it." Harlow set down his pen. Over a period of approximately 3 years, an entity called Arlen Capital Partners acquired beneficial ownership of the primary legitimate assets associated with your business interests through a series of legal transactions. The transactions were individually structured as routine corporate amendments, management agreement updates, LLC restructurings, and real estate closings in escrow. Each transaction carried your signature. "I didn't sign anything transferring my assets to anyone. You signed the documents that enabled the transfers. The transfers themselves were triggered by clauses within those documents, clauses that define triggering events and automatic transfer conditions." Harlow paused. "You signed them, Damien. I've seen the originals. The signatures are yours." Damien was quiet. The kitchen was very large and very quiet and full of morning light that felt this morning like something punitive. "Who is Arlen Capital Partners?" he said. "The sole beneficial owner of Arlen Capital Partners," Harlow said, with the careful precision of a man delivering information he knows will be received badly, "is Elena Carter." The name landed in the kitchen without drama. Damien had known it was coming, had known since the second call of the morning when the pattern had started to emerge. But knowing something is coming and receiving it are two different experiences, and he sat with it for a moment in silence that had a different quality than the silence before. Then he said, very quietly, "She's been planning this. For at least 3 years, based on the document trail. 3 years. He said it the way you'd say a number you're trying to make real. For 3 years, she's been..." He stopped. He pressed his hands flat on the island's surface. "And you didn't see it." Harlow's jaw tightened. "The documents came through standard channels. The amendments were presented as routine administrative updates. I reviewed the summaries." He paused. "I did not review the full text of every amendment." Damien looked at him. The look was long and had nothing comfortable in it. "You didn't read them. You didn't read them," Damien said again with a flatness that was worse than any raised voice. "And neither did I, because we trusted her to be what we thought she was." He pushed back from the island. He walked to the window and stood looking at the backyard, the wet lawn, the trees at the edge of the property line that needed trimming and that were now someone else's problem. "Where is she?" "We don't know. She's not at the apartment." "Check the apartment. Check Sandra Voss's office." "We've done both." "She left Voss's office at approximately 8:45. After that, she's..." "Find her." He turned from the window. "I need to speak to her." Harlow stood. He was a careful man, a man who had built a career on knowing when to push and when to hold, and he held now, for a moment, with the look of someone who has something to say and is deciding whether to say it. "Damien," he said, "I need to advise you, as your attorney, that any direct confrontation with Elena at this point—" "I said find her, Harlow. I didn't say confront her." "Could be characterized as intimidation or harassment, which, given that she's the complaining party in what is almost certainly about to become a divorce proceeding, would be..." "Harlow!" Harlow stopped. "Get out of my house," Damien said, "and find my wife." Harlow got out. The kitchen was quiet. Damien stood at the window for a long time, looking at the lawn, and what moved through him was not the straightforward heat of rage. He'd had that earlier, in the first hour, when the calls were coming in and the picture was assembling itself. That had burned off. What was underneath it was something colder and more specific. the feeling of having been studied, of having been for 3 years an object of careful, patient, invisible observation, of having moved through his life believing he was the one who watched and the one who was never watched, and finding out that he had been wrong in a way so complete that he couldn't locate the beginning of where he had miscalculated. She had been in the room. She had been in the room every time. Quiet, contained, present, at dinners, at meetings, at the kitchen island where she had once poured his coffee with the particular efficiency of a woman who had organized herself so well around his requirements that she had become to him a kind of furniture. And while he had looked past her, she had been looking at everything. He picked up his phone. He called Vanessa. She answered on the fourth ring, which was already different from yesterday, when she would have answered on the first. "Damien," she said. Her voice had a quality in it he hadn't heard before, a careful spacing of syllables, a precision that felt like someone thinking about what they were saying before they said it. "I need you to come to the house," he said. A pause. I'm at my place. I have things today, Damien." "Vanessa." "What?" "Last night," he said, "you were standing next to me when I—" He stopped. He found, unusually, that he didn't have a clean way to finish the sentence. "When I humiliated my wife in front of 60 people to prove something to you. When I made my position clear," he said, "to everyone." "Yes. So I need you to understand that what I did last night had consequences that I'm dealing with this morning, and I need you to come to the house." Another pause. Longer. "What kind of consequences?" The question told him something. He had known Vanessa for 4 years, and he knew her well enough to hear what was underneath that question. She was asking whether the money was still there, whether the position was still there, whether the thing she had stood next to him for was intact. "Come to the house," he said, "and I'll explain." The pause that followed lasted long enough that he understood before she spoke what she was going to say. "I think," Vanessa said carefully, "that maybe this isn't— I think you need to handle this with your people, Damien. I don't want to be in the middle of—" He ended the call. He stood in the kitchen with the phone in his hand and the morning light coming through the window, and he understood, with the particular clarity that comes from a sequence of things arriving in the same hour, that Vanessa Hale had stood next to him last night because standing next to him was worth something. She had been willing to be the reason he publicly destroyed his marriage because the public destruction came with the position she wanted. And now the position was altered. She didn't have the full picture yet, didn't know how altered. And already the careful spacing in her voice, the things today, the "I don't want to be in the middle of," told him everything he needed to know about what Vanessa had actually been standing next to him for. He knew. He had always known, in the way you know things you choose not to examine. But knowing a thing and holding it up to the light are different, and the morning was doing a thorough job of holding things up to the light. He called his other attorney, not Harlow, who handled the legitimate side, but a man named Creed who handled everything else. Creed answered immediately, which was the one thing this morning that went the way Damien expected. "I know," Creed said before Damien spoke. "I've been following it since 6. What can we do?" "Legally? I've talked to 3 people. The transactions are airtight, Damien. Every attorney I've spoken to says the same thing. She structured this over years. The documentation is complete. The signatures are valid. And every transfer was executed under contractual authority that you granted voluntarily." A pause. "There's no fraud angle. There's no coercion angle. There's no error in the paperwork. There has to be something. There might be a long-shot argument around conflict of interest. She was operating as an agent of your business interests while simultaneously building a competing interest. But that argument requires proving that she had a fiduciary duty to you that she violated, and her attorney, Voss, has probably anticipated that argument and built the structure specifically to neutralize it." Another pause. "I'm going to be honest with you. This was done by someone who understood exactly what they were doing and had years to make sure it was bulletproof." Damien said nothing for a moment. He said, "The other side." Creed's voice shifted, a subtle compression, like someone adjusting their grip. "What about it? Is any of it exposed by this?" "The legitimate structure was the buffer," Creed said. "Without it—" He stopped. "Without it what?" Without the legitimate layer, the other assets have less insulation. The shell company structure still holds, but if anyone with federal authority starts looking at the overall picture and noticing that the clean layer has suddenly been surgically removed, he stopped again. It raises questions. About what was underneath it. Yes. Damien sat down on one of the kitchen stools. He pressed his thumb against his temple. He thought about Elena walking out of the Cortellini Grand the night before without shedding a single tear. He thought about the 3 years of documents he had signed without reading. He thought about the diagram of his own financial structure that he now understood she had been mapping, quietly and completely, the entire time. Creed, he said. Is it possible she gave that information to someone? A long pause. What kind of someone? Federal. The pause that followed was the longest of the morning. When Creed spoke, his voice was very controlled. Do you have a specific reason to believe that? No, Damien said. I have a general reason. He thought about the clarity with which she had walked out of that room, the absence of tears, the phone she had picked up before she'd even reached the lobby. She had a plan, he said. She's been planning for 3 years. And last night wasn't the end of her plan. It was the beginning of the next part. He set down his phone and looked at the kitchen and the lawn and the trees. Find out if the feds are moving, he said. Now, today. I'll make calls. Creed, he paused. If they are, if she's talking to them, I need to know before she says anything they can use. Another silence. Then, carefully, I understand. Damien ended the call. He sat alone in the kitchen of a house that was no longer his, in a life that had been restructured around him while he slept, and he felt the cold, specific weight of a mistake he could not yet fully measure. He had looked at Elena Carter for 7 years and seen a woman who was good with paperwork. He had looked at her last night and seen something to make kneel. He had never in 7 years looked at her and seen what she actually was. He was beginning to understand that this oversight was going to cost him everything. At 12:43 in the afternoon, Elena woke in Sandra's guest suite to the sound of her phone buzzing against the nightstand. She had slept for 3 hours in her clothes, and she came awake the way she always did. Completely, immediately, with none of the gradual assembly of consciousness that other people seem to require. She looked at the screen. Sandra. The injunction was filed at 11, Sandra said when Elena answered. Harlow's firm, exactly as predicted. Emergency motion to freeze the Arlen Capital transfers pending review of alleged fraud. And? Denied at 12:30. Judge reviewed the documentation and found no basis for emergency relief. A pause. Elena, the judge used the word meticulous in the denial order to describe your paperwork. Elena sat on the edge of the bed. What else? Reyes called. She's ready when we are, and Sandra paused, with a quality in it that Elena had learned to pay attention to. I received a call this afternoon from a man named Creed. He identified himself as representing Damien's other interests, the non-Harlow interests. Elena was very still. What did he want? He wanted to know whether you would be open to a private conversation, off the record, before any further legal action. He's scared, Elena said. He's trying to find out what you know and who you've talked to. Another pause. Elena, if Damien's people are calling Creed, it means he's worried about the federal angle, which means either he already knows you spoke to Reyes or he suspects it and he's trying to get ahead of it. Elena looked at the room around her, spare, clean, the guest suite of a woman who lived efficiently and without sentiment. Outside the window, the city was fully awake in the afternoon light. She thought about Creed's call. She thought about what it meant for Damien to be using Creed instead of Harlow. Harlow was the daylight side. Creed was everything else. What did you tell him? Elena said. I told him that Ms. Carter communicates exclusively through counsel and that any off-the-record conversations were not available. Sandra paused. He said, and I want you to hear this exactly. He said, tell her that the situation has dimensions she may not have fully considered and that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. The room was quiet. Outside, a horn sounded somewhere on the street below and then faded. Elena stood up. She moved to the window and looked out at the afternoon city and felt the words arrange themselves in her chest the way a threat arranges itself. Not as noise, but as geometry, as shape. Creed was not threatening her physically. He was telling her that there were people, beyond Damien, who had an interest in the structure she had dismantled, and that those people had not yet made themselves visible. She had known this was possible. She had known that Damien's empire was not Damien alone, that he operated within a larger network of criminal interest, that the Moretti name was the visible node of something that extended in directions she had never mapped, because she had deliberately not looked. She had taken the clean layer and walked away from the dirty structure. She had believed that this separation would keep her clear. Creed's call was telling her that the separation might not be as clean as she'd built it to be. "Sandra," she said. "Yes." "Call Reyes. Tell her we're ready to meet today." She paused. "Tell her I have more to offer than I indicated this morning. And tell her I need the cooperation agreement in writing before I say another word." A beat of silence. "Elena, if you go into a cooperation agreement with the federal government, there's no version of this where Damien doesn't know you cooperated. He already suspects it. Suspecting and knowing are different." "Not anymore." She looked at the city. She thought about a phone ringing in a car, in the rain, a woman's voice measured and professional telling her that some things could be determined in the next 48 hours. She thought about Creed's message. "Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed." "We opened the door last night," she said. "I'm not interested in closing it." She could hear Sandra breathing on the other end, the careful, controlled breath of a woman processing information and deciding how to carry it. "All right," Sandra said finally. "I'll call Reyes." "One more thing," Elena said. "Yes." "Find out who Creed is actually representing, not Damien, the people behind Damien." She paused. "I need to know what I walked into the middle of before I walk any further in." She ended the call. She stood at the window for another moment, and then she picked up the burgundy dress she had slept in, still serviceable, barely wrinkled, and she went to find the bathroom, because the next meeting required her to be fully present, and being fully present required, at minimum, a clean face and 10 minutes of quiet. She had the 10 minutes. She would use them. What she would not have, what no longer existed for her, as of the moment she'd received Creed's call, was the version of this plan where she handed what she knew to federal investigators, signed her cooperation agreement, and then stepped cleanly sideways into the life she had been building toward. That version had assumed a two-party problem, her and Damien, clean assets and dirty ones, a separation she could execute and then exit from. Creed's call had told her there was a third party she had not accounted for, and that third party had an interest in what she knew, and in what she chose to do with it, and the message, "Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed," was not advice. It was a warning. Sandra Voss had been practicing law for 38 years, and in that time she had developed a precise vocabulary for distinguishing between the kinds of silence that meant a client was thinking and the kinds that meant something had broken. The silence Elena brought into the conference room at Voss and Associates at 2:15 that afternoon was the second kind. Not shattered. Elena Carter did not shatter. Sandra had understood this about her from the first meeting, but fractured in a specific place, in the particular region where a person keeps their certainty about the shape of what they've built. Reyes was already there, Duarte beside her. A third person Elena hadn't met, a man in his 50s named Garth Pelham, introduced as senior counsel for the Financial Crimes Division, who had the compact, unhurried manner of someone whose patience was not a personality trait, but a professional instrument. He had flown in from Washington that morning, which told Elena, before anyone said anything, that the conversation she was about to have was larger than the one she had walked into at 9 o'clock. She sat down. Sandra sat beside her. Elena put her hands flat on the table. "Before we begin," Elena said, "I want the written cooperation agreement, non-target status confirmed in writing, signed by someone with authority to sign it." Pelham opened a folder and produced 3 pages, which he slid across the table. Sandra took them. She read them with the speed of someone who had been reading legal documents for 4 decades, which meant she read them slowly and without appearing to. Elena waited. Outside, traffic moved on Lexington Avenue and a siren went past and faded. "Page 2, paragraph 4, Sandra said. "The language around voluntary disclosure needs to be tightened. Any information known or reasonably knowable is too broad. We need it limited to information within her direct knowledge." Pelham looked at Duarte, who made a note. We can accept that modification, Pelham said. Paragraph 7. The confidentiality provision needs a reciprocal clause. The government agrees not to characterize Ms. Carter as a cooperating witness in any public filing. We can accept sealed cooperation status through the indictment phase, Pelham said. Beyond that, I can't promise. Sandra looked at Elena. Elena nodded once. Acceptable, Sandra said. She continued reading. One more modification, minor, regarding the timeline for debriefing sessions. Pelham accepted it. Duarte's pen moved. Reyes had not spoken. She was watching Elena the way she'd watched her in the morning, with the focused, patient attention of someone who was letting the process run and already thinking about what came next. At 2:40, Sandra set down the document. We'll sign, she said. The signing took 4 minutes. Elena's signature was the same as it always was, clear, compressed, a signature that gave nothing away about the hand that made it. Reyes opened her own folder. Let's start with the shell company structure, she said. Specifically, the relationship between 3 entities, Delray Holdings, Kestrel Management, and a Cayman-registered company called Meridian Gate Trust. Elena looked at the names. She recognized 2 of them immediately. Delray and Kestrel had both appeared in documents she'd processed over the years, not as entities she managed, but as entities that appeared periodically in the correspondence that crossed her desk. She had noted them. She had not investigated them. She had understood them, from context, as part of the structure she had deliberately not mapped. I've seen those names, she said. In what context? Correspondence, wire confirmations, occasionally in the distribution lists on internal memos that I received as a matter of standard administrative routing. She paused. I was never told what those entities were or what they did. I understood that it was not information I was meant to have. But you noted them, Reyes said. I note everything. Reyes nodded. She produced a second document, a transaction record, dense with numbers and account designations. In March 3 years ago, there was a cash transfer of approximately $14 million from a Delray Holdings subaccount to a domestic LLC called Harborview Realty Group. Do you recognize Harborview? Elena was quiet for a moment. She did. Harborview Realty Group was one of the entities she had restructured, one of the clean LLCs she had transferred into Arlen Capital's ownership. She had believed it was clean. She had verified its tax filings, its documented revenue streams, its property management history. She had treated it as a legitimate real estate holding entity and structured it accordingly. The $14 million transfer in March 3 years ago, which would have been before she restructured it, had not appeared in any document she had reviewed. It had not appeared because it had been routed through a sub-account she had not had access to, in a banking relationship she had not known existed. I recognize the entity, Elena said carefully. I didn't know about that specific transaction. Reyes looked at her steadily. Ms. Carter, Harborview Realty Group is currently owned by Arlen Capital Partners. The sentence landed in the room with a weight that was different from the other sentences. Elena felt it land. She kept her expression still. Her hands, flat on the table, did not move. But something in her chest shifted. A quiet, structural shift, like a beam that has taken more load than it was built for finding the first edge of its limit. I understand what you're saying, she said. $14 million of what we believe to be proceeds from narcotics distribution passed through Harborview Realty Group in March 3 years ago was laundered through a series of real estate transactions and is currently, as of this morning, when your transfer is completed, sitting inside a legitimate holding company that you control. The room was quiet. Sandra put her pen down. I didn't know, Elena said. I believe you, Reyes said, and she said it in a way that was neither warm nor cold. She said it as a factual assessment, the conclusion of an evaluation. But believing you and being able to prove you didn't know are different things. And the people across the table from us at trial will not be making the same assessment I am. Elena looked at the transaction record. She looked at the date. March, 3 years ago. She had begun the restructuring process 7 months later, in October of that year, working from documents she had accessed through her role as Damien's administrative and financial manager. She had identified Harborview as clean based on its public filing history and the documentation available in the files she maintained. The sub-account, the one the 14 million had moved through, had not been in those files. It had been somewhere else. In a banking relationship that was off the books, or in a separate filing system she hadn't had access to, or she stopped. She stopped because something had arrived in her mind that she needed to look at directly, even though she did not want to. She needed to ask a question, and the question was this. Had Harborview been inserted into her restructuring deliberately? Had someone, knowing what she was doing, knowing she was mapping the clean layer and building the transfer architecture, ensured that a dirty asset was positioned to look clean so that when she transferred it, she became the instrument by which $14 million of criminal proceeds entered a legitimate holding company under her control? She said, "How long have you known about the Harborview transaction?" Reyes didn't hesitate. 14 months. And the restructuring, the Arlen Capital transfers, you've been watching those? We've been aware of the restructuring process for approximately 18 months. Elena looked at her. You let it happen. Reyes said nothing. You watched me transfer the assets, including Harborview, into Arlen Capital. You had a 14-month-old transaction record showing dirty money passing through Harborview, and you let the transfer complete. Elena's voice had not changed register. It was the same flat, controlled instrument it had been for the entire meeting. But something behind it had gone very tight. Why? Because, Pelham said, from the end of the table, speaking for the first time in 20 minutes, it created a situation that was useful to us. Elena looked at him. Useful. The transfer put the Harborview asset inside Arlen Capital, under your name, under your legal control, which gives us a basis for a conversation that we would not have had if Harborview had remained inside the Moretti structure. He paused. Ms. Carter, we are not interested in you. We have never been interested in you. What we are interested in is the network that sits above Damian Moretti. Elena was still. Above him. The Moretti organization is a significant operation, but it is not the apex of the network we're investigating. There are people who use Damian's structure, his distribution channels, his financial infrastructure, who operate at a level that makes the Moretti family look like a regional franchise. Pelham folded his hands on the table. Those people are very careful. They have insulated themselves from everything below them through layers we have not been able to fully penetrate. What we need, what you may be able to provide based on your access to the financial architecture of the Moretti organization, is a path upward, through the structure to the people at the top of it. Elena heard this. She processed it. She looked at the transaction record still open on the table in front of her and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that the situation she was sitting in was not the situation she had designed. She had spent 3 years designing a situation. She had been meticulous and patient and precise. And she was sitting in something else entirely, something larger and older and more complex than anything she had built or planned for. Something that had been watching her build and had decided at some point that she was a more useful instrument inside it than outside it. She said, "I want to speak to my attorney, privately." Reyes, Pelham, and Duarte stood without a word and left the conference room. The door closed. Sandra was already leaning toward her. "Elena, I know. This is not—" "I know, Sandra." Sandra pressed her lips together. She had the look of someone who has professional opinions that are fighting with personal ones and is trying to determine which to lead with. "The cooperation agreement we just signed is predicated on information within your direct knowledge," she said. "What they're describing now goes significantly beyond that. They want you to actively assist in an investigation that targets individuals you have no direct relationship with. That is a different instrument entirely." "I understand the distinction. Do you also understand that if there are people above Damian, people who have been using his structure for their own purposes, those people are aware that the structure has just been disrupted? Your transfers last night weren't invisible. Whatever happened to Harborview, to those $14 million, was visible to the people who put it there." Sandra paused. "Creed's call this morning. Some doors. Once opened." Elena looked at the table. She thought about Creed. She thought about the careful spacing of his words, the message delivered through Sandra rather than directly, the particular texture of it, Not a threat of violence, not a blunt instrument, but a message from someone who was accustomed to communicating in a register where the meaning lived beneath the surface. She thought about who Creed was actually representing, the people behind Damien. "I need you to find out who Creed's clients are," Elena said, "right now, before we bring Reyes back in. I've been trying since this morning. He's structured his client relationships through a blind trust arrangement. I can't get to the names. Then find out what you can about the network Pelham described, the people above Damien." She looked at Sandra. "I need to know if I'm already in the middle of something that I walked into without knowing it, before I decide what to offer them." Sandra looked at her for a long moment. "Elena, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." "Ask." "Is there anything else in the Arlen Capital portfolio? Anything else you transferred last night that could have been positioned the way Harborview was? Any other entity that was presented to you as clean but might not have been?" The question sat in the room. Elena looked at it. She ran through the spreadsheet in her mind. The complete list, 37 entities, every one of which she had vetted from the documentation available to her. She had been thorough. She had been more than thorough. But she had been working from a set of documents that someone else had the ability to curate. And if one entity had been positioned to appear clean while carrying dirty money through a sub-account she couldn't see, then the same could be true of others. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She said, "I need to see the full Arlen Capital portfolio documentation. Everything, tonight." Sandra stood. "I'll get it." She moved toward the door, then stopped. "I'm going to ask Reyes for 30 minutes before we continue." "Ask for an hour," Elena said. Sandra left. Elena sat alone in the conference room. She looked at the transaction record on the table. The Harborview document, the $14 million, the date 3 years ago that had preceded her restructuring by 7 months. She thought about the geometry of it. She thought about the precision required to insert a dirty asset into the visible layer of a structure in a way that would look clean to someone vetting it from the available documentation. That required detailed knowledge of how the vetting was being done. It required knowing what documents she had access to and what she didn't. It required knowledge of her process. It required someone who knew she was building something. That list was very short. Sandra Voss, Elena herself, and one other person, the person who had set her on this path in the first place, who had introduced her to the concept of legal restructuring and offshore protection 4 years ago, before she had hired Sandra, when she was still in the earliest stages of thinking about what she might build. A man named Philip Rourke, a financial consultant she had met through a professional connection, who had spent 2 hours with her over lunch, explaining the legal mechanisms available to a person in her position, and who had, shortly thereafter, referred her to Sandra Voss. Elena had not thought about Philip Rourke in 2 years. She had not needed to think about him. He had served his function as a referral and receded from the picture. He was not part of the structure she had built. He was not in any document. He was a lunch and a referral, and she had filed him as background and moved on. She sat in the conference room and thought about Philip Rourke, and the more she thought about him, the colder something in her chest became. She picked up her phone and called a number she used for professional research. A licensed investigator named Cole Marsh, who had done discreet background work for her twice before. He answered on the second ring. "I need a full background on a man named Philip Rourke," she said. "Financial consultant, New York, possibly connected to organized crime financial infrastructure. I need it fast. By tonight if you can." "That's a tight window," Cole said. "I know. What do you need from me?" "Whatever you have." She gave him the limited information she had. The lunch, the professional connection through whom she'd met Rourke, the approximate date, the vague outline of his described professional specialty. Cole listened without interruption. "I'll start now," he said. "But Elena, if this guy is connected to what you're describing, he's going to have a footprint that's been deliberately managed. I may not be able to get to the center of it by tonight." "Get as close as you can," she said. She ended the call. The door opened. Reyes came back in, alone this time. No Pelham, no Duarte. She sat down across from Elena and set her hands on the table and looked at her with the direct assessment-grade attention that had characterized every exchange between them. "Your attorney asked for an hour," she said. I need to ask you something, Elena said. Reyes waited. Philip Rourke, Elena said. Is that name in your investigation? Something happened in Reyes's face. It was minimal, a slight tightening around the eyes, a fractional adjustment in the set of her mouth, the kind of micro-response that a less practiced observer would miss entirely. Elena did not miss it. Where did you hear that name? Reyes said. Elena felt the cold thing in her chest expand. He's in your investigation. Ms. Carter, he referred me to Sandra Voss. Elena kept her voice flat and direct. 4 years ago. He was the person who first outlined the legal restructuring options available to me. He told me what was possible. He pointed me toward the attorney I used to build the structure I built. She paused. Is Philip Rourke connected to the network above Damien? Reyes looked at her for a long moment. She looked at her with something that, for the first time, had a human quality in it. Not sympathy, exactly, but the acknowledgement of something that required acknowledgement. Philip Rourke, she said carefully, is a person of significant interest in our investigation. The sentence was a grenade delivered in a quiet voice. Elena sat with it. She felt the specific total quality of what it meant, not in the abstract, but in the particular, in the sequence of events that it reorganized. 4 years ago, a man she had believed was a professional referral had outlined in precise and useful terms the exact legal mechanism she subsequently used to dismantle Damien Moretti's empire. He had then referred her to the attorney who helped her execute it, and that attorney, whom Elena had trusted absolutely, whose work she had relied on completely, who was at this moment somewhere in this building reviewing documents, had been introduced to Elena by a man who was a person of significant interest to a federal investigation into a criminal network that operated above Damien Moretti, which meant one of two things. Either Sandra Voss was clean and had been used unknowingly the same way Elena had been used, or she was not. Elena stood up. The movement was sudden enough that Reyes's posture shifted, not alarm but readiness. Where is Sandra? Elena said. She's in one of our conference rooms reviewing. Elena was already at the door. She pushed through it into the hallway. A federal building's interior, all identical hallways, identical doors, the anonymous architecture of institutional space, and she moved through it without knowing exactly which room she was looking for, until she saw Duarte standing outside a door at the end of the corridor, which was the kind of detail that told her everything she needed about which room she wanted. She pushed the door open. Sandra was at a table. She had a laptop open and a stack of documents beside her and a phone face down that she had been looking at when Elena came in. And when Elena came in, she looked up, and what was in her face was the wrong thing. Not surprise. Not the expression of a woman interrupted in her work. Something else. A rapid adjustment. The face reconfiguring itself in the half-second between the door opening and eye contact being made, and it was the speed of the adjustment that told Elena what she needed to know before a word was spoken. She had spent 7 years learning to read a face that was managing what it showed. She was very good at it now. Elena, Sandra said. I was just... Philip Rourke, Elena said. Sandra was still. The adjustment stopped. What replaced it was a stillness that had a specific quality. The stillness of a person who has reached the end of a calculation and is determining what comes next. You know that name, Elena said. Sandra set down the papers she was holding. She set them down with care, aligning them against the edge of the table. She did not look at the phone. Sit down, she said. Tell me what Philip Rourke is to you. A pause that lasted 4 full seconds. Elena counted them. He was a client, Sandra said, before you, several years before. A client. Yes. And when he referred me to you, when he sent me to your office 4 years ago, you knew who he was. Sandra looked at her steadily. I knew who he represented. The room made a sound that was not a sound. The interior sound of something shifting irrevocably. Elena stood at the door and looked at the woman she had trusted more completely than she had trusted anyone in the 7 years of her marriage, the woman whose geological steadiness she had relied on, whose counsel she had followed, whose assurance that the documentation was airtight she had accepted as absolute. Who does he represent? Elena said. Elena, sit down and let me. Who does he represent, Sandra? Sandra looked at her. She had the expression of a person who is past the point of managing the information and has arrived at the point of delivering it. The network above Damien, she said. The people Pelham described. Rourke is their financial architect. He's been building and managing their asset structures for 15 years. She paused. When you came to me, when Rourke sent you to me, I understood what the assignment was. I understood that I was being asked to help build something that would, at a specific moment, be useful to Rourke's clients. The words were landing in Elena one at a time, each one requiring a moment before the next could be received. She gripped the door frame with one hand. Useful, she said. In what way? The Arlen capital structure, say, the transfers last night. The clean layer of the Moretti Empire moving into your hands. That's not a problem for the people above Damien. That's a solution. Sandra's voice had not changed register. It was still the geological voice, still the voice of controlled delivery, but what it was delivering had changed completely. Damien had become a liability. His ambition, his carelessness, his increasing visibility. The people above him had been looking for an exit from the Moretti structure for 2 years. What you built gave them one. The legitimate assets are out of the Moretti name and into a clean structure, fully legal, fully documented. Damien takes the fall for the criminal operation. The people above him walk away from his network without having ever had their names associated with it. And the clean assets, she paused. They have an interest in Arlen Capital, Elena. Elena felt the air in the room change density. What kind of interest? A contractual interest, not documented in anything you've seen. An agreement between Rourke and a beneficial owner of Arlen Capital that was established before your restructuring began, before I took you on as a client. Sandra paused. You built the structure. You believe you own it. But there is a prior claim on 40% of Arlen Capital's assets that predates your restructuring by 2 years. The silence was complete. Elena stood at the door and understood, in the full and total sense of understanding, what had happened to her. She had spent 3 years building what she believed was her escape, her freedom, the architecture of a life she could control. And what she had actually done, what she had been guided, expertly and patiently, to do, was clean dirty money for a criminal network she had never seen, transfer it into a legal structure they had prepositioned a claim on, and deliver it to them in a form that no prosecutor could touch. She had not been the architect. She had been the instrument. Her hand on the door frame was the only thing in the room that moved. A slight tightening of the fingers, a whitening at the knuckles, and then even that stopped. She looked at Sandra Voss, who was looking back at her with the level gaze of a woman who had done what she had been paid to do and had arrived at the moment where the person across the table understood it. There was no pleasure in Sandra's face, no cruelty, just the flat geological stillness of a woman who was very good at her work and had been doing it for someone else the entire time. How much of what you told me was true? Elena said. The question came out even. She was surprised, somewhere underneath everything, at how even it came out. The legal work is real, Sandra said. Every document is valid. Every transaction is defensible. I did not fabricate anything. The structure you built is exactly what it appears to be. She paused. The difference is that you built it for an audience you didn't know you were performing for. Elena released the door frame. She took one step into the room. She looked at the laptop, at the stack of documents, at the phone face down on the table. That phone, she said. Who were you calling? Sandra's eyes moved to the phone and then back to Elena. In that movement, that one small, involuntary movement, Elena had her answer. She crossed the room in 4 steps and picked up the phone before Sandra could reach it, and she looked at the screen, at the last outgoing call made 6 minutes ago to a number she didn't recognize, and she felt the last piece of the architecture click into place with the cold finality of a lock engaging. Sandra had been calling to tell them that Elena knew. Elena looked up from the phone. She looked at Sandra Voss, 38 years of law, 4 years of what Elena had believed was absolute and unshakable trust, the one person she had built everything around. And Sandra looked back at her, and neither of them said anything. And in the silence, Elena understood that she was standing alone in a federal building with a cooperation agreement in her name, a holding company that carried a prior claim she hadn't known about, and a criminal network that had just been informed she had figured it out. Outside the door, she could hear Reyes's footsteps coming down the corridor, and she understood that the next 60 seconds were going to determine whether she spent the following years of her life inside a legal structure someone else controlled or completely outside every structure she had built, with nothing but what she understood and no one she could trust, and that the only advantage she had left was the 11 seconds before the door opened and the choice was made for her. She looked at Sandra one last time. She put the phone in her coat pocket, and she walked toward the door, not away from it, toward it, because the only move left was forward, and because she had learned, somewhere in the long, cold education of 7 years with a man who mistook fear for... The door opened before Elena reached it. Reyes stood in the frame. She looked at Elena, then past her at Sandra, and the 2-second read she performed on the room's atmosphere was fast and accurate. She stepped inside and pulled the door closed behind her. "Something happened," she said. It wasn't a question. "Sandra Voss has a prior professional relationship with Philip Rourke," Elena said. Her voice was the flattest it had been all day. "She was placed as my attorney by Rourke's clients. The Arlen Capital structure has a pre-existing beneficial interest held by parties connected to the network you're investigating. Sandra made a phone call 6 minutes ago to a number I don't recognize." She held up the phone. "This is her phone. The call is in the log." Reyes looked at Sandra. Sandra looked back at Reyes with the composed stillness of a woman who had, Elena understood now, spent 38 years maintaining composure in rooms where composure was the primary defensive instrument. She said nothing. Reyes said, "Ms. Voss, I'm going to ask you to stay in this room." She stepped back to the door and opened it. Duarte was in the corridor. She spoke to him quietly, too quietly for Elena to hear, and he moved away fast. Reyes came back in. "Sit down," she said to Sandra. Not roughly, just finally, Sandra sat. She set her hands on the table. She had the look of someone who has arrived at a destination they knew was coming and has decided, in the last stretch of the approach, to stop managing and simply arrive. Reyes turned to Elena. "The phone number," she said. Elena handed her Sandra's phone, son. Reyes looked at the log. She looked at it for 3 seconds, and something shifted in her expression. The same micro-adjustment Elena had seen earlier when she'd said Rourke's name, but larger this time, and with a quality in it that was closer to urgency than anything Elena had seen from Reyes in the previous 5 hours. She turned to the door again, and this time she spoke at full volume. "Duarte, now." He came. She showed him the screen. He looked at it and said, "That's the Meridian Gate line." Meridian Gate Trust, the Cayman entity from Reyes's original diagram, the third name in the network structure at the top of everything. Elena watched Reyes and Duarte process this in the compressed, efficient way of people whose professional training had prepared them for fast reassessment, and she understood, from the speed of it, that the number Sandra had called was not a surprise to them. It was a confirmation of something they had suspected and were now holding as certainty. Reyes looked at Elena. "We need to move you." "Move me where?" "Secure location. Tonight." She was already in motion, picking up her own phone, dialing. "The call Sandra made tells them you know, which means wherever you were planning to be tonight is compromised." Elena absorbed this. She thought about Sandra's guest suite, where she'd slept 3 hours that morning, where her overnight bag was, where the code Sandra had given her was presumably now in the hands of people who worked for Meridian Gate Trust. She thought about the Arlen Capital portfolio, 37 entities, every one of which she now needed to examine for the same contamination she'd found in Harborview. She thought about the prior claim Sandra had described. 40% of everything she'd built, a contractual interest that predated her restructuring, that she had not known existed, that someone had spent 4 years positioning her to create. She thought about Damien. "Reyes," she said. Reyes was on her phone. She held up one finger. "Wait." Elena waited. She looked at Sandra, who was sitting at the table with her hands folded and her face set in the neutral, geological expression that Elena now understood was not personal composure. It was professional performance. It had always been professional performance. The steadiness Elena had read as character was methodology. The willingness to never flinch was not loyalty. It was the discipline of a woman who was very good at maintaining a role and had been maintaining this one for 4 years. Elena felt something move through her that was not anger. It was larger than anger and colder. It was the particular sensation of understanding how completely you have been seen, observed, assessed, anticipated by someone who was using that understanding against you. She had spent 7 years inside that sensation with Damien and had believed when she walked out of the Cortellini Grand that she was walking out of it permanently. She was standing in a federal building and it was happening again, from a different direction, with a different face. "Enough," she said aloud. She said it quietly. Sandra looked at her. Reyes, still on her phone, glanced over. Elena wasn't talking to either of them. She pulled out her own phone. She called Cole Marsh. He answered on the first ring. "Tell me you have something," she said. "Partial," he said. "Rourke has a structured professional history. The surface is clean, financial consulting, legitimate clientele, all the right credentials. But there's a gap. 3 years between 2009 and 2012 where nothing public exists. No filings, no registrations, no professional affiliations. I talked to someone who knew him peripherally in that period. Described him as working for a European financial group that doesn't exist anymore, based in Luxembourg." "Meridian Gate Trust," Elena said. A pause. "I couldn't confirm that name, but the Luxembourg connection matches. There's also, Elena, this is preliminary, there's a legal entity called Rourke Advisory Group that was registered in Delaware 14 years ago. The registered agent is a firm called Ashwick Partners. I looked at Ashwick's other registered entities." He paused. "Arlen Capital Partners is on the list." The floor of the room did not move. It felt like it moved. Elena stood absolutely still and let this settle into the structure of everything she knew. Arlen Capital Partners, the holding company she had believed she created, that she had named, that she had structured with Sandra Voss as the legal architect, had been registered through an agent that also served Philip Rourke's advisory group. The entity she believed she had built from nothing had been, in some structural sense, pre-existing, pre-shaped, a container that was ready for her before she knew she was going to fill it. "Cole," she said, "send me everything you have. All of it. Right now." "Sending." She ended the call. Reyes had finished her call. She was standing in the center of the room looking at Elena with the full attention of someone who has just understood that the situation has moved faster than they planned for. "We need to go," Reyes said. "Now." "I need 30 minutes. "Elena." 30 minutes, Elena said, "because what I just learned changes what I can give you, and what I can give you changes the entire structure of your case. Give me 30 minutes and a room with a secure terminal, and I will give you Meridian Gate Trust from the inside." Reyes looked at her. She looked at her for 5 full seconds, which was 5 seconds of calculation that Elena could almost hear. Then she said, 20 minutes, and moved to the door. The room they gave her was smaller than the conference room, with a single terminal and no windows, and a federal agent named Briggs who stood by the door without speaking. Elena sat at the terminal, opened the files Cole had sent to her secure account, and began to read with the concentrated speed she had developed over 3 years of processing financial documentation that someone else assumed she was merely filing. The Ashwick Partners connection was the thread. She pulled it. Ashwick had registered 47 entities over 14 years. She recognized 3 of them immediately from the Moretti structure. Not Arlen Capital, not Harborview, but 2 others, smaller, that she had encountered in passing correspondence and noted without investigating. She ran them against the Arlen Capital portfolio. 2 of the 37 entities she had transferred last night had been registered through Ashwick. 2 others had Ashwick-affiliated addresses in their original incorporation documents. 4 entities. 4 contaminated entities inside a 37-entity holding structure. She looked at the transaction histories available to her through the Arlen Capital Management account Sandra had set up, and found, in each of the 4, the same signature. Irregular cash inflows at intervals that didn't correspond to legitimate business cycles, routed through sub-accounts with separate banking relationships, cleaned through the entity's legitimate operations, and emerged on the other side as documented business revenue. She had transferred 4 laundromats. She had done it legally, with valid documentation, without knowing what they were. And the people who had positioned those entities inside the structure she was vetting had known, because Sandra had told them exactly which documentation she was reviewing and which she wasn't. She wrote everything down. Not in notes, she built a map. A financial diagram, the kind she had been reading for years on the other side of the table, but this one flowing from her own knowledge outward. The Ashwick connection, the 4 entities, the transaction signatures, the sub-account pattern. She connected it to what Reyes had shown her about Delray and Kestrel and Meridian Gate. And in the connecting, she saw a shape that she recognized, not from any single document, but from the aggregate of 7 years of watching how money moved through the Moretti structure and understanding the logic of the movement, even when she hadn't been told the logic directly. The network above Damien was using the same structural methodology at every level, the same pattern of insertion, clean entity, dirty subaccount, legitimate revenue as cover. It was a signature. And she had 7 years of pattern recognition sitting in her head that she was now, for the first time, applying to this instead of to the question of her own survival. She had 19 minutes and she used all of them. When Reyes came back, Elena turned the terminal screen toward her and said, "That's your connective tissue." Reyes looked at the diagram. She called Pelham. Pelham came in and looked at the diagram and was quiet for 45 seconds, which was the longest she had seen him be quiet. And then he said, "Where did you get this?" "I built it," Elena said. "From what I know, from what I've watched for 7 years, from the documents Cole Marsh sent me an hour ago, and from the pattern recognition I've been developing since the first time I saw the name Delray Holdings on a distribution list and understood that it was something I wasn't supposed to understand." She paused. "The 4 entities I've marked are inside Arlen Capital right now. The transfers completed this morning. They're legally mine, which means that right now, tonight, I have legal authority over 4 entities that Meridian Gate Trust has been using as laundering vehicles." She let that sit for a moment. "I can use that authority?" Pelham looked at her. "In what way?" "The sub-accounts, the separate banking relationships those entities have been using. I have signatory access through the Arlen Capital management structure. Sandra set it up that way, which she did, I understand now, because Rourke's clients wanted that access available. But the access runs both directions." She looked at Pelham directly. "I can freeze those sub-accounts. Tonight. Before Meridian Gate Trust can move the funds currently sitting in them." Reyes said, "How much?" "Based on the transaction pattern, somewhere between $30 and $50 million across the 4 accounts. I don't have the current balances, but the accounts exist and I have the authority to lock them, and I can do it before they figure out I've mapped it." The room held a silence that had a specific quality, the silence of people recalculating how much something is worth. Elena sat inside it and waited, because she understood that what she had just offered was the difference between a cooperation agreement that kept her clean and a cooperation agreement that made her central to one of the largest organized crime financial prosecutions in a decade. And she understood that the second version was more dangerous, and also the only version that gave her enough leverage to survive what Sandra's phone call had set in motion. Pelham said, "If you freeze those accounts, the network knows immediately." "They already know I'm here," Elena said. "Sandra's call told them. The question isn't whether they know. The question is whether I move faster than they do." Reyes and Pelham looked at each other. Some communication passed between them that Elena couldn't fully read. Then Reyes said, "We'd need a federal warrant to freeze accounts of that size under our authority. That takes time we don't have tonight." "You don't need a warrant," Elena said. "I'm the legal signatory. I'm not a federal agent. I'm a private individual exercising authority over accounts I legally control under the management structure of Arlen Capital Partners, which is legitimately mine. The contamination of how it got to be mine is your investigation. The authority itself is valid." She paused. "I can do this right now, from this terminal, and there is nothing illegal about it." Another silence, shorter this time. "Do it," Pelham said. Elena turned back to the terminal. She logged into the Arlen Capital management system. Sandra had provided the credentials 3 days ago as part of the standard account access setup, never imagining Elena would use them for this. She navigated to the entity management portal. She found the 4 entities she had flagged. She accessed each one's banking information. The sub-accounts were there, separate institution, separate routing, the secondary banking relationship that had been invisible in the original documentation and was now, through the Arlen Capital Management portal, fully accessible to her. She froze the first account at 4:47 p.m. It took 11 seconds. She clicked through the confirmation screens with the same focused precision she'd brought to every document she had ever processed, and when the confirmation appeared on screen, she moved to the second account without pausing. The second froze at 4:48, third at 4:49. She was navigating to the fourth when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. She declined it. It rang again immediately. She declined it again. Reyes, watching over her shoulder, said, "Don't answer that." "I know." She froze the fourth account at 4:51. 4 confirmations on the screen. She took a photograph of each one with her phone. Documentation, because she had learned in 3 years that documentation was the only thing that held when everything else failed. Then she turned from the terminal and looked at Reyes. "Done," she said. Reyes already had her own phone up, speaking to someone Elena couldn't hear. Pelham was at the door, also on a phone. The room had shifted from deliberation into motion, and Elena sat in the center of it in the calm that she had learned to maintain when everything around her was accelerating, and she felt, in that calm, the particular sensation of having spent the last available resource. She had given them everything she had. The diagram, the 4 entities, the frozen accounts. She had nothing left in reserve. Her phone buzzed. Text message, unknown number. She looked at it. It said, "You made a mistake. Give us back what you froze and walk away. You have 2 hours." She showed it to Reyes without a word. Reyes looked at it, photographed it with her own phone, and said, "We're moving you now." "Where?" "Federal custody. Protective." "No." Elena stood. "Not federal custody. If I'm in federal custody, I'm visible. Anyone who wants to know where I am looks at your intake records. I need to be somewhere that isn't on paper." Reyes stared at her. "Elena, these people just threatened you." "I know what they did. You're a civilian. You're not—" "I am the person," Elena said, with a precision that cut through the room, "who just froze $50 million of their operating funds. I understand what that means better than you do right now, because I understand how they think, and you understand how we think, and those are not the same thing." She picked up her coat. "I need a phone that isn't traceable to me. I need a car that isn't government-plated. And I need you to move on the warrant for those accounts within the next 90 minutes, before their attorneys file an emergency motion to unfreeze them. Because once that motion is filed, the window closes." Reyes looked at her for a long moment. She had the expression of a woman who was running 2 calculations simultaneously and finding that they both led to the same place. "Briggs," she said. The agent at the door turned. "Get her a clean phone, and call Martinez to bring the unmarked." Briggs left. Reyes turned back to Elena. "There's something you need to know," she said. Her voice had a quality Elena hadn't heard in it before. Not warmth, but something that was choosing, deliberately, not to be strategic. "The threat you just received. 2 hours. That's not an arbitrary number." Elena looked at her. "Tell me." Damian Moretti met with a man named Creed at 3:15 this afternoon. "We had surveillance on the meeting. We don't have audio. But 40 minutes after that meeting ended, there was activity on 3 Moretti-connected accounts that suggests a rapid asset movement. What's left of the criminal revenue stream, trying to relocate before we can freeze it." She paused. "Creed told Damian something at that meeting. We don't know what, but Damian left the meeting and went directly to the Lexington Avenue building." "That building is under Arlen Capital now," Elena said. "Yes." Reyes paused. "He's there right now, with 4 other individuals we've identified as Moretti associates. We have people outside, but we're not going in without a warrant, and the warrant is 20 minutes out." She looked at Elena. "He may not know the building is yours now, or he may know and not care. Either way, he's sitting in an asset you legally control, with people we consider dangerous, and he's been talking to a man who works for the network that just sent you a 2-hour deadline. Elena thought about Damien in the Lexington Avenue building. She thought about what the building contained, not just the commercial tenants, but the management office on the 3rd floor, where she had spent hundreds of hours processing documents, where the filing systems she had built over 3 years were stored in a server room that also contained backups of every document she had ever produced in her role as the operational manager of Damien's legitimate businesses. Documents that went further back than the restructuring. Documents that might contain, for someone who looked carefully, evidence of things she had observed and noted without acting on. Things that would be useful to a defense attorney trying to establish that Elena had known about the criminal enterprise and participated in it, rather than merely observed it. "He's going after the files," she said. Reyes said nothing. "The 3rd floor management office, the server room." Elena looked at her. "How long has he had access to the building today?" "He arrived at 4:20. 23 minutes before Elena had frozen the accounts. 23 minutes in which he could have already accessed the server room if he still had the building codes. She had changed the external access codes when the transfer completed. Sandra had arranged that, which now had a new and different meaning, but the internal codes, the server room specifically, she had not changed because she had not imagined anyone would be in the building to need them changed. "The server room code?" Elena said. "Is it in any document Sandra had access to?" The answer was in Reyes's face before she spoke. "We don't know what Sandra gave them." Elena picked up the clean phone Briggs had returned with. She dialed the building's management emergency line from memory. She had called it enough times over 3 years that the number lived in her without effort. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She hung up. She dialed the primary tenant on the 2nd floor, a commercial insurance firm, whose office manager she had spoken to monthly for 2 years. The office manager answered. "This is Elena Carter," she said. "I need you to tell me whether there are people on the 3rd floor of the building right now." A pause. The office manager, a woman named Denny, efficient and literal, who had always responded well to Elena's directness, said, "We heard footsteps up there about a half hour ago. Figured it was management." "It isn't," Elena said. "I need you to take your people and go to the lobby right now. Not the stairs, the elevator. Go to the lobby and wait outside. Don't use the stairs." A longer pause. "Ms. Carter, Please," Elena said. "Now." She heard movement on the other end. She ended the call. She looked at Reyes. "The warrant," she said. 15 minutes. "He's been in there for 30. In 15 minutes, the server room is empty." She paused. "Or he decides the files aren't enough, and he does something that the 4 people with him make possible." Reyes was already back on her phone. Pelham had come back into the room and was listening. Elena stood and watched the 2 federal agents coordinate in the compressed, precise shorthand of people who had worked together long enough to communicate in half sentences, and she understood that the next 15 minutes were outside her control in a way that nothing in the previous 24 hours had been. She had been the one building, executing, deciding. Now she was standing in a room waiting for other people to move, and the particular helplessness of it was a sensation she had been trying to escape for 7 years. Her phone, Sandra's phone, still in her coat pocket, buzzed. She had forgotten it was there. She pulled it out. A text had come in to Sandra's number from the Meridian Gate line. She read it. 4 words. She has the phone. They knew. They had known from the moment she walked out of that room with it, which meant the 2-hour deadline was not tied to the frozen accounts. It had started the moment she left that corridor with Sandra's phone in her pocket, the moment they understood that Elena Carter had mapped the full shape of what had been done to her and was standing inside a federal building with the phone that connected Sandra Voss to Meridian Gate Trust. She looked at the timestamp on Sandra's text. It had come in at 4:44 p.m. She had frozen the last account at 4:51, 7 minutes after they knew she had the phone, which meant they had known she was going to freeze the accounts before she froze them, and they had let her do it anyway. She felt the cold thing in her chest return, sharper than before. She thought about why you would let someone freeze your operating accounts when you knew they were about to do it. You would let them do it if the accounts themselves were not the asset you were protecting. You would let them do it if the real asset was something else, and the freeze was a distraction, something that put Elena in motion, kept her occupied and visible, while the real play happened somewhere else. She looked at Reyes. "The Lexington Avenue building," she said. "Tell me what's on the third floor, not just the management office. What else?" Reyes looked at her. "Commercial tenant space, management office, server room. What else?" A pause. Reyes turned to Duarte. "The building manifest." Duarte pulled it up on his tablet. He scrolled. He stopped. "Third floor, Unit 3C, listed as storage, associated with Harborview Realty Group." He looked up. "That unit transferred to Arlen Capital this morning as part of the Harborview asset package." Harborview. The contaminated entity. The $14 million. And a storage unit on the third floor of a building where Damian Moretti was right now, with 4 associates, in the 32nd minute of unauthorized access. "What's in the storage unit?" Elena said. Duarte looked at the manifest. "No contents listed." Elena looked at Reyes. "I own that unit," she said. "Legally. As of this morning. And whatever is in it is legally on my property." She let that land. "Which means if Damian removes it, it's theft from a legal asset holder," Reyes said. Her voice had gone very quiet and very fast, the voice of someone moving through implications at speed. She was back on her phone before she finished the sentence, and this time the word she said to the person on the other end was not measured or procedural. It was a single word, the word that meant the calculation had completed and the window was closing. "Go," she said. Elena was already at the door. Briggs put a hand out, not grabbing her, just present, a wall of professional obligation. "Ma'am, you need to stay." "I own the building," Elena said. "I own what's in it. I have every legal right to be there." She looked at Briggs with the flat, direct gaze she had been using since 9 o'clock that morning on people who thought she was someone who could be redirected. "Are you going to physically stop me?" Briggs looked at Reyes. Reyes was still on her phone. She looked at Elena over the phone, and the look was the calculation completing. And then she said to Briggs, "She's with us." And to Elena, "Stay behind me. No exceptions. Do you understand?" "Yes," Elena said. They moved. The unmarked car was outside, Martinez behind the wheel, and Elena got in the back with Reyes while Duarte took the front and Briggs followed in a second vehicle that appeared from the federal building's underground exit. Pelham stayed behind. He was the warrant. He needed to be on the phone until it came through. And without the warrant, the agents outside the Lexington Avenue building were watching, not moving. Elena sat in the back of the car as it pulled into Manhattan traffic and felt the city around her, enormous and indifferent, moving at its own rhythms, completely uninvested in what was happening inside the specific motion of this specific car. And she thought about what was in Unit 3C. She thought about the $14 million and what form it would have taken when it moved through Harborview. Not cash. Cash at that volume was ungainly and traceable in its own way. Documents, records, the kind of physical evidence that a network like Meridian Gate would want in a controlled location. Not in a bank, not in a digital archive that could be remotely accessed and remotely destroyed, but in a physical space. Something they could retrieve and remove. Something that, in the right hands, could be used as leverage over the network itself, over the people above Rourke, above Meridian Gate, the apex that even Pelham hadn't fully named. Damian was not going to that building to destroy evidence. He was going there to take it. He had been told, by Creed, at the 3:15 meeting, that the building was now Elena's, which meant the storage unit was now Elena's, which meant that whatever was in it was no longer in the network's protected custody, and Creed's clients wanted it back before the federal warrant arrived and made it a crime scene. The car turned onto Lexington. Elena looked out the window and saw the building, 15 stories, glass and concrete, the unremarkable face of commercial Manhattan, and saw the 2 unmarked vehicles already parked on the block, and the posture of the agents inside them, which was the particular posture of people waiting for permission to move. Traffic moved around them. The building's lobby was visible through the glass front. A security desk, a guard who was either complicit or simply uninformed, elevator banks beyond. Reyes's phone buzzed. She looked at it. She said, "Oh, warrants through." She was out of the car before Martinez fully stopped. Elena was one step behind her, and Briggs was one step behind Elena, and the instruction "stay behind me" was still technically in effect, and Elena was technically behind Reyes as they moved through the lobby, past the security guard who Reyes addressed with 2 sentences and a badge, to the elevator bank. The elevator took 14 seconds to arrive. Inside it, Reyes and Duarte and Briggs arranged themselves with the particular spatial awareness of people who expected the doors to open on a situation, and Elena stood among them and breathed steadily through her nose and thought about nothing except the floor numbers ascending on the display above the door. 3. The doors opened. The corridor was empty. Standard commercial hallway. Gray carpet, overhead lighting, a fire door at the far end, doors on either side. The management office was to the left. Unit 3C was to the right, at the end of the corridor, and its door was open. Not ajar. Open. Light from inside spilling into the hallway, and from the elevator across the distance of the corridor, Elena could see the edge of a figure moving inside the room. Reyes held up a fist. Stop. And they stopped. She listened. The sound from inside 3C was the sound of someone moving quickly through a space. The particular sounds of drawers and containers, of a person in a hurry handling physical objects. One person. The 4 associates she had described. Where were the other 4? Briggs moved to the stairwell door and checked it, and came back with 2 fingers raised. 2 people in the stairwell. Duarte touched his ear and said something subvocal into his radio. The agents outside were covering the exits. The other 2 associates were accounted for. That left Damien. In Unit 3C, alone. Reyes looked at Elena. Elena looked at the open door at the end of the corridor. She thought about standing at the top of the marble staircase at the Cortellini Grand the night before, looking down at a room full of people who had made her invisible for 7 years. She thought about the marble floor. She thought about a single word delivered in the voice of a man who had never imagined the word would cost him everything. Reyes moved. Duarte flanked left. Briggs flanked right. They covered the corridor in 8 seconds, and were at the door of Unit 3C before the figure inside had registered the sound of their approach. And then Reyes was in the doorway with her badge up, and her voice at full command volume saying the words that turned a situation into a legal fact, and Elena stepped to the edge of the doorframe and looked inside. The room was not a storage unit. It had been presented as one in the manifest, but it was a document room. Shelving units along 3 walls, bankers' boxes stacked and labeled in a system Elena recognized immediately as the same labeling system she had used in the management office. Someone had adapted her own organizational methodology to create a filing system she had never been shown. Boxes that corresponded to the entities in the Arlen Capital portfolio, and others she didn't recognize, and in the center of the room a folding table on which 4 boxes had been opened, and their contents partially removed. Damien stood at the table. He was in the clothes she imagined he'd put on in a hurry that morning. Dark jacket, no tie. The version of him that appeared when the performance of power had been stripped down to its substrate. He was holding a manila folder. He looked at Reyes, at Duarte, at Briggs, and then his eyes moved past all of them to Elena in the doorway. And what happened in his face was the most complex thing she had seen there in 7 years of watching it. Not rage, not fear. Something that lived between them. The specific expression of a man who has spent his entire life being the person who holds the information and is standing in a room where someone else has just made him the person who doesn't. Damien Moretti, Reyes said, federal warrant, step away from the table. He didn't move immediately. He looked at Elena, just looked at her. With the folder still in his hand and the dismantled boxes on the table between them and the full weight of the previous 24 hours arranged in the air of the room, he said, "You have no idea what you just opened." Elena said, "I know exactly what I opened." He looked at her for another second. Then he set the folder down on the table with a deliberateness that was, she understood, the last exercise of control available to him. The controlled placement of a folder, the refusal to drop it, and he stepped back from the table. Duarte moved in. Briggs flanked. Reyes spoke into her radio. And Elena stood in the doorway of a room she legally owned, looking at the boxes and the table and the dismantled contents of 4 years of something she had been kept outside of. And she understood that what was in those boxes was not just evidence. It was the complete map of the network she had been moved through like a piece on a board. Every entity, every transaction, every connection from Damien upward through Rourke to Meridian Gate and whatever existed above it. The documentation that the network had stored here because they needed it accessible and needed it physical and had believed, until 24 hours ago, that the building and the unit and the legal structure around it were safely under their control. She had taken the building. She had taken the unit. She had taken, without knowing it, the most valuable thing the network possessed. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She looked at the screen. Then she looked at Reyes, who was 6 feet away coordinating the room with the compressed efficiency of a federal agent in the middle of a situation. "Reyes," she said. Reyes looked at her. Elena held up the phone. "It's them," she said. "Meridian Gate. They're calling me directly." Reyes crossed to her in 3 steps. She looked at the screen. She said, "Answer it," and produced her own recording device, which she held close as Elena accepted the call and raised the phone to her ear. The voice on the other end was not Creed. It was a voice she had never heard, older, accented faintly with something European, unhurried in the way that people are unhurried when they have never in their lives been required to rush. A voice that belonged to someone who was accustomed to being the person above the person who handled things. "Ms. Carter," the voice said, "I think it's time we spoke directly. You've been quite remarkable. But you should understand that what you're holding, what you think you've won tonight, is not the end of anything." Elena looked at the room, the boxes, Damien being walked toward the door by Duarte, the shelves of labeled evidence, Reyes's recorder, the clean phone in her hand with its untraceable number, and the voice of a man who had spent 4 years moving her toward this room without her knowing it. "I know," she said. "It's not the end." She paused. "It's mine." A silence on the other end, long enough that she wondered if the call had dropped. Then the voice said, with the first inflection she had heard in it, not anger, not quite, but the edge of something that had not expected to be. The voice on the other end of the phone said nothing for 4 seconds after Elena spoke. She counted them the way she had counted everything in the past 24 hours, with the precise attention of someone for whom numbers were not abstract but structural, the bones of every situation she had ever navigated. Then the voice said, with the measured quality of someone adjusting their approach in real time, "You're standing in a room full of federal agents, Ms. Carter. I think you understand that what you're holding tonight is evidence in a case. It is not yours. It will never be yours." "The building is mine," Elena said. "The unit is mine. The contents of a storage unit in a building I own are mine until a court says otherwise, which means right now, tonight, I am standing in my property with federal agents who have a warrant, and you are on a phone somewhere deciding how much exposure you're willing to accept." A pause. "You don't know who you're talking to." "I know what you are," she said. "That's enough." She ended the call. She looked at Reyes, who had the recorder still up and the expression of someone who has just received something unexpected and valuable. "Did you get the number?" Elena said. "We got it." Reyes lowered the recorder. "European routing. We'll trace it." She looked at Elena with the direct assessment she'd been using all day, and there was something in it now that had not been there at 9 o'clock that morning. Not warmth, but a quality that was closer to respect than evaluation. "You need to step back from the room. This is a crime scene now." Elena stepped back. She stood in the corridor and watched the federal process take over. More agents arriving from the stairwell, boxes being photographed in place before anything was touched. A forensic documentation team that materialized with the speed of people who had been staged nearby and waiting for exactly this. She watched them work through the doorframe, and she thought about the labeled boxes and the filing system that mirrored her own methodology, and she felt the last of her disbelief about Sandra Voss complete itself and settle into something she would carry forward without drama. Damien had been walked to the elevator. She had not looked at him again after he set down the folder. She did not need to. She stood in the corridor for 20 minutes while the room behind her became federal property, and then Reyes came and stood beside her and said, "We need your formal statement tonight, all of it, the full account from the beginning." She paused. "It's going to be a long night." "I've been awake since yesterday morning," Elena said. "I know." Reyes looked at her. "I'm going to ask you something, and you don't have to answer it now." Elena waited. "When you started building the Arlen capital structure 3 years ago, when Rourke sent you to Voss, and Voss set up the accounts, and you began the restructuring, at what point did you suspect that something was wrong with the arrangement?" Elena looked at the corridor wall. She thought about the question honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about anything. 18 months ago, she said, there was a discrepancy in the Harborview cash flow that I noticed when I was reviewing the annual management report. It was small, $15,000, that didn't correspond to any documented transaction. I flagged it to Sandra. She said it was a reconciliation error from the prior year and that it had been corrected. Elena paused. I believed her, or I chose to believe her. I'm not sure those are different things. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Why are you telling me this? Because you asked, Elena said. And because I'm done managing what I show people. She looked at Reyes directly. I made choices over the past 3 years that I believed were legal and self-protective and intelligent. Some of them were all three. Some of them were made in a context I didn't fully understand, which doesn't make them less mine. She paused. I want my statement to be complete. I want there to be no version of events from any angle that is more complete than the one I give you tonight. Reyes looked at her for a moment. Then she said simply, All right. The statement took 6 hours. Elena sat in a federal conference room with Reyes, Pelham, a court reporter, and a rotating cast of agents who came in and out as different portions of her account required different expertise, and she spoke with the comprehensive, organized precision of someone who had spent 7 years processing information and filing it in a mental structure that was, if anything, more meticulous than the physical filing systems she had built. She spoke about Rourke, about the lunch, about what he had told her, and what she had understood from it. She spoke about Sandra. Every interaction, every document, every moment she had chosen to trust, and every moment she had noticed something that didn't quite fit and chosen not to examine it. She spoke about Damien, about the 7 years, about what she had seen and understood, and deliberately not investigated because the investigation would have required a response she wasn't yet ready to make. She spoke about the restructuring, the transfers, the overnight execution. She spoke about the Harborview discrepancy and the choice she had made to believe the explanation she'd been given. She held nothing back. Not because she was immune to the vulnerability of it. She felt the vulnerability in every disclosure. The specific exposure of naming the moments where she had been wrong or afraid or willfully uninformed. But because she understood, with the clarity that had characterized her thinking since she walked out of the Cortellini Grand, that the only structure that would hold now was one built entirely on what was true. She had spent too long inside structures built on what was manageable. This was the last one she intended to build, and she was going to build it right. At 2:40 in the morning, Pelham closed his folder and said, I think we have what we need for tonight. He looked at Elena across the table with the expression of a man who has received significantly more than he expected. Ms. Carter, I want to be direct with you about where this goes from here. Elena waited. Sandra Voss will be charged. Philip Rourke will be charged. Damien Moretti will be charged with a range of federal offenses that your account tonight significantly strengthens. He paused. The Meridian Gate Network, the people at the top of this, we've been trying to reach them for 4 years. What you've given us tonight, between your financial diagram and the documents in Unit 3C and the recorded call, is the closest anyone has gotten. He paused again. This will be a long case. It will go to trial. You will testify. I know, Elena said. Your cooperation agreement stands. Your non-target status stands. The Arlen capital structure, once we extract the 4 contaminated entities under court order, will be returned to your legal control minus those assets. He folded his hands. The prior claim that Sandra described, the Rourke Advisory Interest, was never formally registered in any jurisdiction we can identify. Our forensic accountant spent the last 3 hours looking. It may have been a threat designed to make you believe you had less than you did. Elena absorbed this. She thought about Sandra telling her there was a prior claim. She thought about the particular timing of that disclosure. The moment when Elena had just understood the full shape of the betrayal. The moment of maximum disorientation. A prior claim delivered at the moment of maximum disorientation was not information. It was a tool. A way of making her feel that even what she had built was not hers, that there was nowhere to stand. She was trying to make me give up, Elena said. Probably, Pelham said. It didn't work. No, Elena said. It didn't. She left the federal building at 3:15 in the morning. The night air was cool and still held the edges of the earlier rain, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let it settle against her face. She had been awake for approximately 38 hours. She had, in that time, dismantled an empire, discovered that the structure she'd built to replace it had been infiltrated, frozen $50 million in criminal operating funds, delivered a complete account of 7 years of observed criminal activity to federal investigators, and stood in a corridor on the 3rd floor of a building she owned while the last remaining piece of what Damien Moretti had called his life was processed as evidence. She was, by every legal and practical measure, standing alone on a sidewalk in Manhattan at 3 in the morning with a clean phone and the clothes she'd worn to a party the night before. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could locate the beginning of, like herself. She found a hotel 3 blocks away, not her usual standard, a mid-range business hotel with a lobby that smelled like industrial cleaner and a night clerk who didn't look up from his screen. And she paid cash, which she had thought to withdraw from an ATM while still inside the federal building. And she took the room key and rode the elevator to the 7th floor and stood in the bathroom of room 714 and looked at her reflection in the fluorescent light above the sink. She looked like what she was. A woman who had been awake for 38 hours and had spent them doing something extremely difficult. There were shadows under her eyes that had a settled quality, like they had moved in and intended to stay for a while. Her hair had come loose from whatever structure it had been in the night before and was doing something independent. The burgundy dress was still on her body and would probably never fully recover from the night and day it had witnessed. She looked at herself for a long time, not searching for something, not assessing, just looking, the way you sometimes look at a place you are about to leave for good, trying to take in the full particulars of it before you go. She slept for 11 hours. She woke at 2:30 in the afternoon to 3 missed calls from Reyes, 1 from Cole Marsh, and 1 from a number she recognized after a moment as belonging to a woman named Patricia Ames, a commercial real estate attorney in Midtown who had done small pieces of work for Elena over the years, and who had, 2 years ago, said over lunch that if Elena ever decided to do something on her own, she should call. Elena had thought about that lunch twice in the past 2 years and filed it without acting on it. She returned Reyes's calls first. Damien had been formally charged overnight. Wire fraud, money laundering, racketeering. Bail had been set at a number his remaining attorney would struggle to reach without the legitimate asset base that no longer existed. Creed had been identified and was under investigation. Sandra Voss had been arrested at 6 a.m. at her home in Westchester and had, according to Reyes, requested an attorney and said nothing else. The forensic team had spent the night in Unit 3C and had produced a preliminary document inventory that Pelham described as, in his words, significant. The word from the European routing on the overnight call had not yet produced a name. Reyes said it would. Elena believed her. She called Cole Marsh. He had additional material on Rourke, a fuller picture of the Luxembourg years, connections that Pelham's team was already working. She thanked him and told him to send the invoice to a new address she would provide. She did not call Patricia Ames back that day. She put the number in her pocket and thought about it while she ate the first real meal she'd had in 2 days. Room service, a club sandwich she consumed methodically and without ceremony, and she thought about what Patricia had said. If you ever decide to do something on your own. The divorce filing had been submitted by Sandra before Sandra's arrest, which meant it was in the system and moving. Elena's new attorney, a divorce specialist Reyes' office had referred, A careful and precise man named Gerald Hoyt, who had read the Arlen Capital documentation in 2 hours and described it as the most thorough pre-divorce asset protection he had ever reviewed, told her that the proceedings would be uncomplicated. Damien's legal exposure from the federal charges meant that his attorneys had significantly larger concerns than contesting asset transfers that were documented, legal, and defended by a cooperation agreement with the federal government. The marriage of 7 years would end with the same quiet, documented efficiency with which Elena had approached everything else. She spent the following week in the mid-range business hotel because she had nowhere else to be. She did not think of this as sad. The apartment was still technically accessible to her. It was in the Arlen Capital portfolio, one of the clean entities, untouched by the contamination, but she had no desire to return to it. It was a place she had made comfortable and efficient, and it had been comfortable and efficient in the way that a well-organized holding pattern is comfortable and efficient, and she did not want a holding pattern anymore. On the third day in the hotel, she called Patricia Ames. Patricia picked up immediately. "Elena Carter," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that told Elena she had been following the news, which had covered the Moretti arrests with the enthusiasm of a city that enjoyed watching powerful men fall from specifically this height. "I was wondering when you'd call." "You said if I ever decided to do something on my own," Elena said. "I did. I'm deciding." A pause, and then Patricia laughed. A short, genuine laugh, the laugh of someone who had been expecting a call and was pleased to find it was arriving exactly on time. "What kind of something?" she said. "Commercial real estate," Elena said. "Legitimate, documented, clean. I know how to read these structures better than most people in this city, and I know which ones are built to last and which ones aren't." She paused. "I have capital. I have a portfolio, once the federal process resolves, of clean assets. And I have 7 years of watching how a business empire operates from the inside, which turns out to be an education that is not available in any school." "No," Patricia agreed, "it is not." "I want to build something," Elena said, "from the beginning, under my own name. Nothing inherited, nothing arranged, nothing that anyone else gets to claim a prior interest in." She paused. "I'd like to talk about whether you want to be part of it." They met the following afternoon in Patricia's office, a clean space in a midtown building that Patricia owned a floor of herself, which Elena noted with the professional appreciation of someone who recognized a good structural decision. Patricia was 54, with close gray hair and the particular directness of a woman who had spent 30 years in a male-dominated industry and had stopped softening herself somewhere in her early 40s and found the experience clarifying. They talked for 3 hours. Not about the Moretti case, not about the arrest, not about what Elena had been through. Patricia had read the news and asked no questions about it, which was one of the first things Elena respected about her. They talked about the market, about specific opportunity areas, about the difference between asset acquisition and asset development. They talked about what a structure built for longevity looked like, as opposed to one built for maximum near-term extraction. They talked about legal architecture, the clean kind, built for transparency rather than concealment. At the end of 3 hours, Patricia said, "When do you want to start?" Elena said, "I already have." The federal case moved through its stages over the following months with the slow procedural momentum of the justice system at work. Elena testified twice, once before a grand jury and once in a pre-trial deposition that lasted 4 days and covered the full scope of her financial account. She sat across from attorneys who were very good and very aggressive, and who had been paid very large amounts of money to find the version of events in which Elena Carter was a participant rather than a witness. And she answered every question with the complete and undecorated accuracy of someone who had decided, in a business hotel at 3 in the morning, that she was done with managed presentations of herself. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. Not in the documents, not in her testimony, not in the 7 years of recorded financial activity that the federal forensic team had now processed completely. She had been, as she had always known herself to be, the person who understood the structure without touching what was dirty about it. The distinction between knowing and participating had saved her, not the legal distinction, though that mattered, the personal one. The choice she had made, early and consistently, to observe without joining. Damien pled guilty 6 months into the proceedings. Not to everything. His remaining attorney negotiated the specific counts, but to enough that the trial that would have required Elena to sit in a courtroom across from him never happened. She heard the news from Gerald Hoyt on a Tuesday afternoon while she was in the middle of reviewing a site assessment for a mixed-use development in Lower Manhattan, and she set down the assessment and sat quietly for a moment and then picked it up again. She did not feel what she might have expected to feel. She had spent some time in the quiet months of building trying to identify what she expected to feel when the legal machinery completed itself, and she had found that the expecting was more interesting than the feeling itself, which turned out to be something very quiet and very final. Like a door in a house you no longer live in clicking shut. She thought about him sometimes, not frequently, and not in the register of grief or rage or any of the things that might have been reasonable after 7 years. She thought about him the way you think about a period of your life that required everything from you and produced, as its primary output, the person you became as a result of surviving it. She did not resent the education. She resented some of the tuition. That was the most honest accounting she could make of it, and she had decided that honest accounting was the practice she was going to maintain for the rest of her life, including internally. Vanessa Hale, she learned from a mutual acquaintance at an industry event 8 months after the Cortellini Grand, had quietly left New York. The acquaintance mentioned it without malice, the way people mention the comings and goings of figures in a world where everyone is eventually revealed to be contingent on the conditions that surround them. Elena absorbed the information and moved on to the next conversation. She had never thought about Vanessa Hale as the problem. Vanessa had been a secondary character in a story that was primarily about what Elena had allowed herself to become inside a structure that required her smallness. You couldn't resent the secondary characters without misunderstanding the story. Sandra Voss went to trial. It was a separate proceeding from Damien's, complex and lengthy, and Elena testified in it. She sat across the courtroom from Sandra for 3 days, and Sandra looked at her across the space between them with the same geological composure she had always presented. And Elena returned the look with the same flatness she had returned it with on the 3rd floor of the Lexington Avenue building. Nothing passed between them that was personal. What was personal had already been processed, alone, in a hotel room, in the way Elena processed most things that hurt, completely, privately, and then filed in a location she did not return to. Sandra was convicted on 4 counts. She was 60 years old, and she had spent 38 years building a reputation that had been, Elena now understood, a costume over something else entirely. This was not interesting to Elena in a moral sense. It was a fact about what people were capable of maintaining and for how long and for what purpose. She filed it beside what she knew about Damien and what she knew about Rourke, who pled out in a separate federal proceeding with an agreement that required his cooperation with the European investigation, and beside what she knew about herself, what she was capable of maintaining, and for how long, and for what purpose. The prior claim Sandra had described, the alleged Rourke advisory interest in Arlen Capital, had been, as Pelham suspected, a fabrication. A last-ditch attempt to make Elena believe that even what she had built was not hers. It had been designed by someone who understood her with uncomfortable precision, someone who knew that the thing most likely to stop Elena Carter was not a threat against her physical safety, but the removal of the one thing she had built with her own hands. Elena thought about this sometimes, about how well Sandra had known her, about the particular intimacy of being studied by someone who is using what they learn against you. It was not so different, she understood, from 7 years of being invisible to Damien. The difference was that Sandra had paid close attention, which made it, in some ways, more. She did not let herself spend too much time on this. She had work to do. Carter Ames commercial properties, the name Patricia had suggested and Elena had agreed to, the order of the names Patricia's idea and Elena's the quiet acknowledgement that she was not interested in being the face of something at the expense of a partnership that was real, filed its first acquisition 18 months after the night at the Cortellini Grand. A mixed-use building in the Flatiron District, 8 floors, 4 commercial tenants, and 2 residential units, completely clean, completely documented, purchased through a straightforward financing arrangement with a bank that had reviewed Elena's financial history and found it, in the forensic brightness of post-federal investigation scrutiny, entirely sound. Patricia handled the legal architecture. Elena handled the financial structuring and asset assessment. They hired 3 people in the first year and 5 more in the second. The company grew with the particular steadiness of something built by people who understood the difference between growth that is sound and growth that is performed, and who had each, in their different careers, seen enough of the performed kind to have no desire to repeat it. Elena did not speak about the Moretti years publicly. She was asked twice by journalists who were covering either the federal case or the broader story of women who had reclaimed agency from powerful men, and she declined both times with the same simple explanation. She did not think the story she had lived was best told by her, and she did not think telling it was her primary interest. Her primary interest was the work in front of her. The journalists wrote around this refusal, and the pieces that appeared were accurate in the facts they reported and incomplete in the way that pieces about people who decline to perform their own narrative are always incomplete, which suited Elena fine. She found an apartment, not the Arlen Capital one, which she sold through Gerald Hoyt as part of the portfolio resolution, but a smaller space in a building she had actually assessed before she bought it, which was the first time she had made a housing decision with the full knowledge base available to her. It was 4 rooms on the 9th floor of a building in Chelsea, quiet, with windows that faced west. She furnished it slowly over the course of months, buying things she actually wanted rather than things that signaled a position she was trying to maintain. She kept very little from the 7 years. A few books, a kitchen knife that she had bought herself in the first year of the marriage when she'd realized that Damien's household had no good knives, which was, she recognized with a kind of rueful precision, the first thing she had ever done inside that marriage purely for herself. She cooked in the new apartment, not elaborately. She was not someone whose relationship to food was theatrical, but regularly with attention. She went to bed at a reasonable hour. She worked long days and did not think of this as sacrifice, because it was not. It was what she wanted to be doing, for the first time in a very long time, with the time she had. She kept the gold band in a box in the top drawer of the dresser in the bedroom. She had taken it off the morning after the Cortellini Grand, the morning she'd slept in Sandra's guest suite, before she knew what Sandra was, which meant she had taken it off believing she was in the hands of someone she trusted, and this was, she had decided, the correct understanding to carry of that moment. She had taken it off in good faith. That it had turned out that the faith was misplaced did not change the moment of taking it off. She kept the ring because throwing it away seemed like a performance of feelings she didn't have, and because it was a piece of gold she'd owned for 7 years, and she was done performing and done discarding things she owned. Reyes called occasionally. The Meridian Gate investigation was ongoing. The European routing of the overnight call had produced a name she was not permitted to share with Elena until the relevant proceedings concluded, which Reyes acknowledged with the frank directness that Elena had come to appreciate in her. The investigation had expanded. The documents from Unit 3C had produced what Pelham had called, in a rare moment of expressed satisfaction during one of their last meetings, a map. Elena thought about what it meant that what she had accidentally acquired was the map these people needed, that in trying to protect their most important asset by sending Damien to retrieve it, the network had instead confirmed its location to a federal agent standing in a doorway. She thought about how Damien had set the folder down on the table. That deliberate placement, that last exercise of control, 6 seconds before everything ended. She thought about what it must have felt like to stand in that room and understand, in real time, that the woman he had made kneel on a marble floor had, without any dramatic gesture or raised voice, ended him completely. She did not feel satisfaction in this thought. She felt something more complex, a recognition that the end of Damien Moretti was not the point of what she had done, that it had never been the point, and that this was the thing he would probably never understand. He would reconstruct her actions as revenge because revenge was a motive he comprehended. The actual motive, survival, autonomy, the refusal to remain inside a structure that required her non-existence, would remain, she suspected, outside his ability to fully receive. That was not her problem anymore. On a Tuesday in the second year, 14 months after the Cortellini Grand, Elena sat at her desk in the Carter Ames office and reviewed the financials for their third acquisition, a commercial property in Brooklyn that Patricia had identified and Elena had assessed, and both of them had agreed was exactly what they were looking for: undervalued, structurally sound, in a neighborhood that was moving in the direction that neighborhoods move when the underlying conditions support it. She reviewed the numbers with the focused attention she brought to all documents, and when she reached the final page and the final column, she set down her pen and looked out the window at the Manhattan skyline visible from the office's east-facing windows. It was a clear day, the kind of clarity the city produces in the fall, when the summer's accumulated weight has burned off and the light comes in at an angle that makes everything look like it has edges again. She looked at it for a while. Then she picked up her pen and signed the page. Patricia came in an hour later and found her at the desk. "Third one's done," Elena said. Patricia looked at the signed document. "Third one's done," she agreed. She sat across from Elena, not in the client chair, which was a formal piece of furniture that neither of them had ever sat in, but in the other chair, the one that had been there from the beginning. "How does it feel?" Elena thought about the question honestly. She thought about the Cortellini Grand and the marble floor, and the 6 hours of telephone calls, and the Federal Building, and Sandra's face adjusting in the half-second between the door opening and eye contact. She thought about a hotel room at 3 in the morning and a reflection in fluorescent light, and the decision she had made in that room to build one more thing, and this time to build it right. "Like mine," she said. Patricia looked at her for a moment and nodded once. A nod that contained, from a woman who did not decorate her responses, everything that needed to be said about where they had each arrived, and how, and what it had cost, and why it was worth what it had cost. Outside, the city continued at its own scale, enormous and indifferent and full of the kind of space that belongs to no one and to everyone. And in it, in a specific building on a specific floor, a woman who had spent 7 years being carefully invisible sat in an office with her name on the door and did the work that was hers to do and did not look back. She had learned what she needed to know about what was behind her. It was time, and it had always been going to be time, to look at what was in front of her instead. To look at it with the same precision and patience and complete unmanaged attention she had spent years developing in the service of someone else's empire, and to use it finally and entirely for her own. The afternoon light moved across the desk. The city moved below. The work continued. And Elena Carter, whose name was on the door and on the documents and on nothing she had not chosen and nothing she did not mean, kept going.